Good morning and welcome to the 8th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2026. And before we begin, can everyone ensure that their electronic devices are switched to silent? And I'm going to do that myself today because I think I forgot. Our first item on the agenda is to decide whether to take item 6 in private and to consider the evidence taken as part of its follow-up inquiry into salmon farming in Scotland in private at item 7 and at future meetings. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We are all agreed. Our next item on the agenda today is an evidence session on the committee's follow-up inquiry into salmon farming in Scotland. When the committee published our report back in 2025, we made a commitment to review progress made by industry and Scottish Government after 1 year. Today we're going to hear from a panel of stakeholders before taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary in a few weeks' time. So this morning, welcome to the meeting. We've got Professor Cathy Dyer, who's the Chair of the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission. We have Ben Hadfield, who is a Director from Salmon Scotland, Amy Jenkins, who is the Veterinary Lead from the Animal and Plant Health Agency, Peter Pollard, who is a Senior Lead for Projects from the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. We have Neil Purvis, who is the Delivery Lead from the Fish Health Inspectorate from the Marine Directorate of the Scottish Government, and Dr Alan Wells, who is the Chief Executive of Fisheries Management Scotland. You're all very welcome. Just to say, you don't need to operate your microphones. The gentleman here will do that for you. Also welcome to the meeting, Edward Mountain, who I will bring in to ask questions at the end of the session. Ed, would you like to make any declarations of interest?
Thank you very much, Convener. And I'd just like to remind committee members that I do have an interest in a wild salmon fishery on the River Spey, which is on the east coast of Scotland and is not directly, as far as I can see, affected by salmon farming. I should also say that in November of last year, I was voted onto the Board of Fisheries Management Scotland as a director. However, as I'm sure Dr Wells can confirm, I have had no input into any policy or decision or discussion on aquaculture because I recuse myself from any discussions and will continue to do so till the end of the parliamentary session. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. We've allocated round about 2 hours for this session, so and we have quite a few questions to get through, so if questions and answers can be as succinct as possible. So I'm going to kick off. So one of our committee recommendations was that the Scottish Government should publish comprehensive, consistent and transparent mortality figures that include the number of fish at a farm, the freshwater mortality, seawater mortality per facility, with accurate numbers of dead salmon, wrasse and lump suckers per week, with accumulative mortality totals at the end of each cycle. So we felt that was a proportionate recommendation, but I was disappointed that Salmon Scotland suggested that it would add regulation, bureaucracy, costs and complexity. But I suppose my question is, and the government also stated that mandatory reporting of mortality would represent a significant burden for producers and regulators, which would not be balanced by significantly high benefit. But we hear regularly from campaigners about mortalities on fish farms and whether these are being accurately recorded. But I suppose my question is, why would it be burdensome if farms who already record mortalities on a daily basis, why would it be more complex to their own operations by just recording all mortalities rather than those over a certain threshold? Who'd like to kick off? Ben.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. We've made enormous progress in transparency and reporting mortality. So you can go in, you can look at individual sites, you can look at the percentage mortality, you can look at the mortality in freshwater. We could possibly go further. I'm quite happy to take that back.
I'm sorry, Ben, could you speak up a little bit? I'm struggling to hear.
Sorry,
Thank you.
We could possibly go further, and I'm quite happy to take that back. But I think, and I hope the committee can recognise that of any animal production system in the UK, it's the most transparent now. So I'm quite pleased with what we've done, but I'm happy to look at going further.
Certainly, I think that there's no question that the committee believes that the figures that you do publish are transparent. However, it's only above a certain threshold, and those numbers are recorded because, as you may well remember, the committee visited a salmon farm and we saw the extensive records that were being held as just part of good management, animal husbandry and so on. So we were quite surprised that we thought that it was suggested that it would add a burden, and that burden would outweigh improved public confidence. What would the extra burden be for farms that are already recording that data as part of their management process?
I think you have to remember that the most important thing that fish farmers do is keep the fish alive and keep the welfare good. It's part of good business, and it's profoundly linked to the bottom line. All the companies are also, in the main, listed companies, well run in terms of inventory, bookkeeping, etc. So the figures are accurate, they're real time and they're live, and the reporting that's out now is comprehensive. If you want to look at what's going on a farm, in February, for example, around about mid-March, you will see the whole industry by site, what the mortality was. So I think that is a big step forward. But if the committee wants us to look at going further, then we can take that on board.
Thank you. Anyone else like to? Neil.
Hi, thanks. I think from an FHI perspective as well, just a point of clarity that the information that we receive is what we need in terms of doing our job. Obviously, we publish that information because of third-party interests and requests that we've had in the past. But ultimately, we see a lot more information than what actually we publish through our case information or our mortality information. As Ben alludes, there's comprehensive records on site that we have access to and we see during our visits. So it's not a question about the information is not there. From our perspective, we collect and record what we need to do our job, which is focused around the Aquatic Animal Health Surveillance Programme, connected to the prevention and control of listed diseases. So I guess what I'm saying is what we get for our purpose and what we publish is satisfactory in terms of us delivering on our regulatory responsibility.
I suppose I can ask the same question to Cathy Dyer. Are you content that the level of reporting of mortalities is fit for purpose and does give the consumer confidence?
It isn't an area that SORC has looked at specifically, so I can't answer in depth because we haven't investigated the mortality reporting for salmon. I think we still have some concerns, particularly around the causes of mortality. We know in other sectors that if we don't know, the sort of blanket figure of mortality is not enough to be able to make progress on mortality. So it may well be that the companies have that, but it's not so transparent to other agencies. But as I say, this is not, the levels of mortality in salmon is not an area that SORC have specifically investigated.
Okay, thank you. Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. One of the issues that SEPA has raised, and this is possibly a question for Peter Pollard, or one of the things that they've looked at, rather, is a new digital regulatory platform. So I'm interested to know what that platform will actually mean in terms of public access to information, how useful it will be to anyone with an interest in this subject, and how that will improve the clarity in the public mind about different companies' performance in environmental terms.
Thank you for the question. So what we're doing is looking at a system to support a separate project which is looking at coordinated consenting. So all the regulators working... Sorry.
I'm certainly struggling. That's better. Thank you. Sorry, Peter, could you continue?
So the digital project you referred to is linked to a project that all the regulators are working on with the Scottish Government to look at coordinated consenting. So the regulators work in a much more coordinated way to determine applications. But the digital project is looking at 3 stages: pre-application process, the application process, and also post-application. So it will try and improve the assembly of information about the applications, the consents that are granted and the performance against those consents in one place, and make it easier for the public to see what the consents are, to see what all the consents are together, how operators are performing against the conditions of those consents, as well as the information that's already available on Scotland's Aquaculture website about emissions and of material into the environment, and about sea lice and about mortality. So it's trying to provide a much more open and transparent picture of what's going on for the public as well as for developers. No, at the moment it's at a very early stage. So the consenting process is in a pilot phase. So we've got 11 pre-applications, applications going through a pilot pre-application process. 4 have already completed that process and now variously moving to the application stage. The digital project is now in discovery and prototyping. So by the end of March, we hope to have a prototype, and then we'll look at if that's going to be effective. We'll look at moving to a build phase on there. So it's in that early digital prototyping phase, and it's in parallel with that practical testing of a pilot.
Thank you. Just on that. So I'm going to go back to my initial question, and I appreciate Neil Purvis's response to say that the data that he gets is sufficient for him to carry out his job. However, one of the issues was public confidence, and it was quite clearly stated in our recommendations. But I don't believe I've really got an answer to why it would be burdensome. I know you've said you'll go away and look at it, but the response was from both the Scottish Government and from Salmon Scotland that it would be burdensome for producers. When you're collecting it, and potentially it might be part of this new digital platform, why would it be burdensome for those figures to be recorded below the 10% threshold or the 5% threshold, wherever that threshold might be set at?
I understand what you're asking. I still maintain that the industry has stepped forward to be the most transparent protein producer in the British Isles. So part of the issue with this is once you've done that, you just ask to go further and further and further. And common sense says that you should take a view at, well, what point is this beneficial? Now I've read all the submissions, and I spent a lot of time with the concerned or the activist community. But part of the issue is it's never, ever enough. And I see, as a manager of a large company in Scotland, every single reason for a fish death, every single environmental parameter. It's copious amounts of well-formatted reports. You could just say, just publish the whole lot, but there has to be a reasonable level of transparency. And I think where we've arrived is, at the moment, you can see the mortality rate per cycle, you can see the mortality rate per farm, you can see what it's been at the end of the month in reasonable time. And that's actually, from my perspective, a genuinely good place to be. If there are specific things about cleaner fish mortality or whether culls take place in the industry, then we will look at that. But I hope you understand that it's never enough. Once you've done that, and we have become the most transparent, partly because of the requests of this committee and taking that on board, but it genuinely is never enough for animal welfare charities or environmental activist groups.
Thank you. Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the witnesses. Ben, I want to come back to you. We could probably debate back and forth for a very long time whether the mortality rates are acceptable. But I'm concerned by what you're saying there, that we can see the figures, because we can't. Those numbers still don't include mortalities in freshwater during transport in that 6-week transfer period, culling and cleaner fish, as you mentioned. So if we still don't know how many fish are actually dying, how can we take any kind of sensible scrutiny of it?
Yeah, thank you. I respect the question, but just to come back a bit on that, the mortality in the Faroe Isles, where it's relatively easy to farm salmon, it's a very kind environment, is about 11%. In Norway last year, it was 14.7%. In Scotland, it dropped for some tough years in 22 and 23 to around 20%. So we know the overall mortality, and we know it per site. So having a site of the cleaner fish mortality, or whether a cull takes place in a hatchery, for example, not clear what benefit that gives. because the whole industry is focused on getting mortality to the lowest possible level. And the target has to be as low as you possibly can with the investment and the production strategy you can make.
Consumer choice. Should people not be able to understand what the scale of mortality is when you are producing food that people are going to buy?
I think you've got to go back to the fact that salmon as a species are strategists. You know, if a female salmon produces between 10 and 15,000 eggs on average. I spawned one, not me personally, but the team spawned one last year that produced 30,000 eggs. So that strategy of that animal is fecundity so that some survive. It's not a cow. A cow has one calf or two calves. So you can't compare the two.
Is that the strategy of the industry as well, though? Because you're talking to me about percentages rather than how many fish, sentient beings, have died.
No, but it's the strategy of the animal, of the species. So salmon farming mortality is very low compared to all the forms of marine and freshwater aquaculture. It's very low compared to wild salmon mortality, which is high, around 98% in some cases. So I think when survival is 80 to 85% in salmon farming, that's fish farmers doing a good job and trying to do everything they can to get the best out of their crop. So I think I back salmon, and we should back salmon as an industry. It provides over 1 billion into the Scottish economy. It's a sustainable form of production, and it's highly nutritious and beneficial for your health. Do I think the mortality is still too high in the Scottish sector? Yes. And I and the 11,000 people are working tirelessly to try and bring it down with huge investment. And it has fallen. Maybe not to the levels that people would like, but we will do everything we can to try and bring it down further.
But without reporting all the deaths?
We report the mortality. At the moment in my company, the mortality is below 0.7% in the month. So we have 24 million fish in the sea currently, and the mortality is around about 140,000 individuals that have died. And I think you can go in and see that for the whole industry in a couple of weeks' time. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about culls and cleaner fish and just give you an honest answer. But I think we've done a lot in response to the requests for the committee. And if you want more, we will take that back and try and deliver it.
This is about public confidence. So I understand different animal production systems. Their mortality needs to be viewed in different ways. So absolutely, you have a wild salmon, 40,000 eggs. If you got one viable, two viable salmon, that's a success in nature, whatever. So how does the industry, that I think the majority of people would like to see be successful and not be quoting mortality, how can the industry improve public confidence and get that message across that you portrayed there, that actually you can't view mortality in fish in the same way you do in other animal production systems like sheep farming or dairy farming or whatever. So whose job is it to get that across, to give the public confidence that the industry is working to the gold-plated standards that the consumer would expect?
I think you have to start with the price achievement for Scottish salmon is significantly above all other origins worldwide. People want Scottish salmon because of the provenance and because of the way it's farmed, at low stocking densities with high quality, and we see that in the marketplace. It commands a significant premium over other origins. Then you have RSPCA, ASC, various assurances, a lot of audits that take place to check that that is the case, that welfare and farming standards are as high as they can be. But you can't get past that this is a very large industry. The biomass of salmon in the sea is far higher than the combined biomass of land animals in Scotland. So the numbers are big, just by the number of fish in the sea. And then you can't get past the fact that the strategy of that animal is, in some cases, to lay between 15 or even more thousand eggs. So the mortality is going to be higher than a cow, for example. And then I think we just have to be open and transparent. Once you start that journey of transparency, you have to deliver it in full. But I question, when I read some of the submissions here, at what point this is actually valuable. You know, compared to directing that money to, for example, wild salmon conservation, which I think is an extremely low amount spent on actual conservation.
Okay, thank you. Cathy Dyer.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to challenge the comparison between farmed salmon welfare and wild salmon. I don't think that's a fair comparison. They operate in different systems, and we have legislation that tells us that if animals are under our care, then it is our responsibility, which doesn't apply to wild fish. I would also, I appreciate that the salmon does have a different reproductive strategy, and we see this in other species as well, but that doesn't mean that there is no welfare cost to the loss of a sentient animal. So I think your problem, I suppose, is selling that to the public, in that we are concerned about the loss of sentient animals. So maybe when they first hatch out, and there's some discussion around at what point would sentience appear in these animals, but I think when you're putting smolts to sea, those animals are without question sentient, and therefore we have a responsibility to those animals, to each animal, not just to the percentage or the tonnage of those animals, but to each animal.
So it's a question on that. So how do you work out what's an acceptable mortality rate in food production?
Sorry, is that to me?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a tricky one, I agree. I think often when we talk about this, there is no acceptable rate, because I think that tells us that we have become complacent. I work with a sheep farmer who tells me that the only acceptable rate of mortality for his lambs is 0%. Now, he knows he can't achieve that, but that's his goal. I appreciate that's a challenge for the industry. I'm not saying we should all be aiming, but we should all be aiming to reduce mortality to the lowest rate possible, because every loss of an animal, this is an unambiguous welfare indicator. If an animal dies, it has suffered. So we do have a responsibility to make that as low as possible.
But you need to accept that there will be mortality in any animal production for food. And the industry, like any industry, will want to reduce that mortality to the very, very minimum. But is it fair to point out and signal out the salmon industry as not actually performing as well as it should do? Where do you set the degrees of acceptance? Again, looking back, you will never get a sheep industry where there's zero mortality, or a poultry industry where there's zero mortality. So where do you set the bar? And at what point do you understand, or do the public understand, that the level of mortality is acceptable and part of that animal's life cycle?
That's an ethical decision rather than a scientific decision, I think. It's about, if we produce animals, we keep animals under our control, we produce them for food, we as a society make a decision about where is it okay for these animals to suffer or to die. And because they're under our responsibility, I think we need to keep that in our minds. So one of the reasons for asking for transparency in these data is evidence that the industry are, you say you're working, and I've been visited salmon farms, I see how hard people work, but people want to see the evidence that you are continuing to focus on reducing mortality, rather than if we say 20% mortality is okay, we've reached 20%, we now stop thinking about how we might try and improve mortality. So it's a challenge to say this is acceptable, but I think it is about accepting that there is a journey towards reducing mortality.
So supposing where there's a challenge to decide what's acceptable is also a challenge and what's not acceptable. Okay. Ben, briefly, and then I'm going to bring in Ariane Burgess.
Briefly, I realise it's an easy caricature, but the idea that we're not focused on the welfare and the sentient animal under our care, that I don't say that you say it's ridiculous. I find that concept ridiculous. I spent every hour of my working life trying to think of how to reduce mortality. And I know that the vast majority of farmers and veterinarians and professionals do exactly the same. The comparison to wild salmon is important. These fish are only perhaps 15 generations removed from the wild. If salmon lay eggs in a river, 2/3 of them will die. When we put eggs down in a hatchery, 98% of them will survive. So you're making gains in farming but then the environment, particularly in Scotland, has been quite tough. So most of the mortality is environmental mortality. So you focused on how can you create the perfect conditions in the pen. But the idea that people are not concerned about welfare and mortality, I don't see that in the sector at all.
I mean, that wasn't really what I said. I think I have seen that in the sector. But I think if you want, part of this discussion is about how you show this to the public. And I think that is where the transparency and maybe part of selling the story that there is high mortality in the wild, but that is not, to me, that is not a comparator. It's not enough to say, well, we don't have that in our farmed salmon, because this is a different scenario. I think if we just can't compare the two, I'm afraid. It's not a fair welfare comparison.
Two seconds.
Yep.
The fact that 98% of that kind of number die in the wild, and farmers are able to create a survival level between 80 and 100% on some occasions is testament to the care and the environment that they provide for the salmon.
I haven't argued against that. I just think the transparency and the desire to keep moving forward, I think, is something that the public do not see.
Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, just continuing on the line around public confidence and the transparency piece. And just to say, I mean, my sense of fish in the wild and fish farmed is two completely different systems. One is nature and one is under human care, I'd like to think. But just around the transparency piece, I feel like we're not getting a sense as a committee that we have that transparency and confidence in data. And I get the point that Fish Health Inspectorate has enough to do its job, but I think it is about public confidence. So if the Aquaculture Stewardship Council audit states input mortality input was high on sites during the last production cycle at Scotsay, but then Salmon Scotland reports it at 0% mortality, that is a circumstance where I'm hearing on one side their mortality is high and then we're getting a 0%. So there's something missing in that transparency piece around the way in which things are being reported. So I'm just wondering if you dispute that at all.
Well, I'm trying hard to understand it. So you say that the ASC audit said that mortality was high, but then Salmon Scotland reported it as 0.
Yeah.
Pardon?
0 input, yeah.
0 input?
Yeah.
0 input of what? Fish?
Yes. So one site is saying that mortality is high, but then the reporting in Salmon Scotland is saying it was 0.
I just don't see how that can be. If there's an audit where ASC have come to the site and from the records observed high mortality, then that will have been captured and reported with transparency in the Scottish Salmon database. The only way that it may have gone to 0 is if, for example, the audit took place in December and then the site was followed out in January and then we report in February. So respectfully, I think that might be a bit confused there.
Okay, so thanks very much for that. I think we'll have to look into that more. But again,
I'm happy to look into it and clarify it for you exactly.
Yeah. I think the other piece that you said earlier in response to the convener was that you're willing to go further. And I do think that Emma Roddick talked about the fact that there's culls, that there's no data on freshwater mortality. However, you are required to report to your shareholders on mortality. And the convener's been talking about the burdensome nature. So in terms of ensuring public confidence, would it be possible for the industry to actually state the full amount of deaths of fish in totality across the whole aspect of production, from the freshwater through to the sea pens and the culls, for the public, not just for shareholders?
Well, first of all, we're deeply respectful of what the committee want, and we've tried to deliver that. At the same time, I think with reason, I caution that for some people and groups, it will never be enough. You're personally welcome to sit with me and go through all those figures in the company that I run. We will try and go further and satisfy the committee in full on reporting. But I told you earlier today, the mortality in the Scottish salmon sector has fallen to around 20%. It's not as low as in Norway, and it's not as low in Faroes, but that is because of environmental and temperature and sea conditions. So you're getting precise figures. So in Mowi, for example, last year the mortality, all the fish in the sea, which averaged from about 28 million down to 22 million in August, the mortality in numbers terms was 21%. In biomass terms, it was 17% of the cycle.
Okay, but you're just talking about sea pens, and what I'm interested in is a transparency on data that takes us from the freshwater all the way through the system.
Mm-hmm. I think you have that. The mortality in freshwater is much lower.
It's that I would like to see all of the numbers recorded and provided together. But I mean, I think that it is concerning. You're saying that there's low numbers, and yet we are still hearing Gobna Ho, 583,942 fish died between September and November 2025 due to gill disease and jellyfish. 240,000 fish died in a single week. 45% died in October. 35% lost in November. So I hear that kind of evening out, and there's a lower number, but there's this kind of roller coaster ride of what's happening, and it will be interesting to see what happens from 2 years from now. When I think overall for me the issue is the warming seas is a fundamental problem for the sector. But I think I'm getting away from information management and data
just
there.
Briefly to come back on that, I know the numbers for the whole sector because I read them and I see them every month, so it's transparent. Why do you not feel sorry for the salmon farmers that lost stock due to jellyfish and environmental conditions? It wasn't their fault. Up until that point, they were farming them with the lowest density worldwide to the highest standards and looking after those fish to the best of their ability. And then environmental conditions cause that level of mortality. It's not that they did anything wrong. In fact, on the contrary, they will have worked, because I know from personal experience, that you're doing your absolute best to try and get the fish past those environmental conditions. I don't understand why there isn't the same empathy that there would be for a sheep farmer during torrential rain as there was earlier this year. I just can't understand that. It's Scotland's largest salmon.
I don't think anyone is not feeling sorry for workers on salmon farms at all here. No one's calling that into question. I think there's a fundamental flaw, which is that we have an industry that has put itself into Scottish waters, and we've got climate change, which is warming the waters, and that is creating a type 1 error for your sector. Yeah.
About transparency over mortality, and I think given the figures you stated, there is some transparency over the figures, or you wouldn't be able to quote them. So I think we've covered what was quite an important part. So I've no apologies for spending that a little bit longer than might have done otherwise. So thank you. I'm now going to move on to a question on fish health, welfare and cleaner fish. A question from Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. And I totally get where mass mortality happens with unforeseen circumstances. That must be heartbreaking for those who are looking after the fish. And I think because it happens in the sea, we don't maybe empathise in the way we did, for instance, with foot and mouth and things like that, where it's very much in our faces. So, but we're all here to try and, I suppose, create transparency and create confidence and create better understanding of the industry. So we've been told by stakeholders, that the Scottish Government's new analytic framework for identifying persistent high mortality uses thresholds and potentially inconsistent data which might not capture problem sites. So I wonder, how can regulators and the industry show that the method can meet the purpose and trigger action in the sites where mortality remains persistently high? And that's maybe slightly different from one-off events, but where mortality, sites that are maybe not suitable because they have persistently high mortality.
So Cabinet Secretary wrote to the committee on 13th of March explained that recommendation will be taken forward. And I think she gave an update in the September time of last year in terms of progress on that. And there's quite a lot of information within there in terms of that specific recommendation at looking whether or not persistent elevated mortality does exist, and then what that looks like. So we've taken, of all the recommendations, excuse me, of all the recommendations that the FHI have been involved with over the time of the committee and such, this has probably been the most significant area in terms of resource that we've put into, and I think it reflects a level of commitment to looking at this problem and the issue. And we've developed a robust model. It's a model and output. It's scientifically driven with FHI input, but also with policy input to look at the issue of persistent elevated mortality. A report is due to come to the committee very soon, I think within the next week to 2 weeks or so, and certainly before the Cabinet Secretary's appearance on the 11th of March, we'll have that report. But at the moment, it's in a preliminary stage in terms of the output and the results. It may be sensible for the committee to digest the content of that report before further questions and queries are pulled upon that.
Sorry. So what you're saying is that the report shows that the system is better, that it is more analytic. It seems that we have huge amounts of data, but we're not really following trends. We're collecting data as lumps rather than, I guess, being more selective, where a one-off event happens, which can be catastrophic, to following underlying data as to where progress is being made or not made. Is the report going to show that we've made progress in that the figures are better explained?
Yeah, it'll show progress in terms of answering the question about persistent and elevated mortality. And that's based upon the definitions that we've set as a group looking at that. And that's explained within the report. It's already been explained in terms of the update. But fundamentally, what we've used is historical data or data that's been collected not necessarily for this purpose. So we've used data sets to help answer the question, to try and help as a kind of a screening tool to highlight sites, and then needed to go in and have a deeper dive really into some of those situations, because as Ben alluded to and Convener alluded to, that salmon farmers have got a vast amount of information. We don't necessarily have all of that information ourselves. And those conversations with the sector over the output are helping to learn better about that persistent elevated mortality question.
So I'll try and answer quite quickly. Although I would say Neil and his team do a fantastic job of what they do, they are kind of at the very end when mortality rises to a level that triggers and they either investigate or they can turn up at any point unannounced. The industry uses a fraction of the consent that it has in Scotland because it's already selected the best sites that it wants to farm in. So there's many, many sites which are dormant and unused. So that process is the first point, to choose the best location. Then the innovation level is particularly high. So we use things like AI to identify jellyfish and algae coming in with the tides. So we can predict whether the fish are going to take an environmental challenge. We develop a lot of vaccines very quickly. 4 or 5 vaccines developed in the last few years. And then we use a blood chemistry process along with PCR detection to look at diseases in the very early stages. So the industry is busy working on all that to try and minimise mortality. But then when mortality occurs above a threshold, that's when the Marine Directorate will come in and analyse the causes and work with the companies to minimise it or instruct the companies to take action. Does that help?
Yeah, but it's about building the public confidence as well, so that the data that the public see, not only do they understand it, but that it's robust. And sometimes the headlines you see are looking at maybe one incident without really explaining what the underlying...
It's not right to dismiss that there's a public concern here, but the demand for salmon as a healthy protein, and from Scottish salmon particularly, is incredibly high. So the idea that worldwide people don't have confidence in salmon as a product, you just need to look at demand, which is often between 5 and 10% per annum. So people have enormous confidence in salmon as a healthy protein. I respect that there's critics in this room and on a wider basis that have a voice. But the production systems that we have in Scotland are amongst the best in the world, and the regulation that we have is particularly amongst the best in the world. So I think there should be confidence in it. But that doesn't stop us attending and answering questions. I think confidence in salmon is rightly high, particularly Scottish salmon.
Just briefly, Convener, I thought it was interesting, Ben, to hear the kind of process of what goes on there. But I'd just be interested to understand how the industry or Maui factors in mortality risk into your decision making.
Yeah, I think that question came up at the last inquiry from Edward Mountain. We budget for a level of mortality that we try and set the bar as low as we think is possible. And then we work tirelessly towards that and invest enormously in it. The sector has invested over 1 billion in the last few years, mainly in treatment systems, particularly wellboats, which have caused a massive reduction in sea lice to the point where, you know, I can honestly say the last few years, sea lice have not been a concern in the company that I run. You have to, they're measured accurately, you have to be aware of them. But the change in freshwater treatments that both treat AGD and sea lice has been revolutionary. But it's come at an enormous cost.
And if I could ask the same question to Fish Health Inspectorate and also Animal Plant Health Agency. So how do you factor mortality risk into the decision making as a regulator?
So, you know, the mortality information that we receive is really useful to us in terms of helping to direct the surveillance that we undertake, because, you know, it could be a prime indicator of a significant disease, a listed disease, and that is really the activity that we're mainly involved in and focused on in terms of ruling out. So having that information is really important from our perspective. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I'm kind of really looking at how do you incorporate mortality risk into the decision making of the Fish Health Inspectorate?
So the information, are you talking in terms of the visits and the inspections that we undertake? Because, you know, we don't actually regulate mortality in any way ourselves from that perspective. But so we'll receive reports over the threshold that come to us, and we'll monitor those reports. We'll try and look at the trend, and then decide, you know, based upon the level of mortality, the reason behind the mortality, the mitigations that are taking place perhaps on site. All of that information will be considered in the round. And then, you know, we also have a routine programme of fish health inspections that are taking place too. So we may pull the routine visit forward earlier and deal with the mortality issue or inspection at the same time.
Okay. So you say you don't actually regulate mortalities in that way. Who does?
We don't regulate mortality. Mortality isn't regulated, to my knowledge,
okay.
From that perspective, in terms of having a set level that you have to meet or achieve. I mean, that's part of what the committee's looking at, isn't it, in terms of its recommendations.
Thank you. Yeah. And then if I could ask the same question to the Animal and Plant Health Agency, Amy.
Thanks. Yeah, so the way that we work very closely with the Fish Health Inspectorate. When they get reports of high mortality, or if they are on farm doing routine or other inspections and they observe any issues relating to mortality or any other things they're concerned about, they get in contact with us. All of those reports then go through a triage process by our vets, and
by who?
By our vets, by senior veterinary inspectors within Animal Plant Health Agency. So those will be vets who will be dealing with all sorts of different things, but also welfare reports in all production species, including fish. As part of that triage process, they will contact the person who was involved in that report from FHI. They will contact the company for further information. They might contact local authorities, and will collect as much information as they can. If at the end of that process, if they identify that there is an unresolved issue that really does need us to go out and inspect, we will then do that. We quite often will take data from the companies or from FHI and assess that remotely. And part of our inspection process does involve a lot of remote inspection of data. We find that really, really useful, especially because of what's been discussed already. It can be very difficult for us to assess individual fish in sea nets. At inspections, again, we wouldn't be regulating towards a specific mortality rate, but we would be looking that a reasonable stockmanship to the best of people's ability is being put in place, and that mitigations were being put in place to reduce that mortality and reduce any suffering that was being experienced by those fish.
Okay. And then in the best of ability, what's the framework for that?
It would be what would be normally expected from a stockman or woman who was well qualified to look after that species. Anybody who has an animal under their care is responsible for maintaining the care of it. We use lots of bits of information to support us with that. So we do use the RSPCA assurance schemes. We now have, I mean, this is slightly off the mortality at sea, but we have the welfare at time of killing guidance. And also all our staff that do these inspections are trained through a course with Stirling University for Fish Health and Welfare.
Okay, thanks.
Can I just remind members to try and stick to the initial question and supplementaries and that, or we're going to end up all over the place, and it's not easy for witnesses or committee members, and it's not fair on other committee members if we start to stray too far from what the original question is. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I'm interested, Ben, just to pick up on what you said about innovative kind of tech that's happening, you know, vaccines, for instance, you mentioned. There's been a lot of research and development and innovation in the last few years. I've been on this Rural Committee on and off for the past 2 sessions, and I've been interested to hear about research and innovation.
Yeah, I've been in this sector for 25 years now, and it's the fastest pace that I've ever seen the innovation work on a whole lot of areas, whether that's vaccines or it's wellboats or it's treatment systems. So what you've seen recently is a move from licensed veterinary medicines like Slice and Azamethopos to control sea lice to pretty much a dominant freshwater and what's often referred to as FLS, or a filtration system to remove sea lice. So that's changed the situation, and the medicine level has dropped by about 70%. And then those systems have been refined, so the mortality during the handling process, of which there always is some mortality, but it's been reduced to well below about 0.5% and often around about 0.2% for the entire population that's treated. And then the vaccine development has been really strong. I think the big hope is that we have a vaccine for a disease called rickettsia, which is being deployed now this year, and that hopefully will take antibiotic use in Scottish aquaculture, which is incredibly low, down to 0. So I think you know that antibiotic use is first and foremost in humans, then in companion animals, and then in other forms of production. And in salmon farming, it's incredibly low already. But the hope is that with these new vaccines, we can get it to 0.
Just dragging it back to the analytic framework and how that's been developed. A very, very brief question, brief response. I appreciate that the industry has invested significant sums in research and so on to develop tools again, for animal husbandry. Have you done that in conjunction with the government, or I'm always aware that, you know, don't reinvent the wheel. So, we were quite critical of the government not being maybe pushing things on. So, has there been that industry regulator joined up approach to the new analytic framework, which builds on the investment that industry has taken for improving animal husbandry in conjunction with the government's role as a regulator?
The quick answer is yes. The prize is high here. So the Scottish salmon puts more than $1 billion into the economy. If we can take the mortality level down further and improve the average weight by, say, 1 kilo, then that will rise substantially. So government has been front and centre. There's been I think, £183 million injected in from various government agencies and private sector. But the industry itself has put $1 billion into these systems. And it is working. You know, the mortality level has fallen quite considerably. But for me, it's still too high, and I want it to be lower.
But I suppose that you're saying that government and industry have worked together. So
Yes.
the investment the industry has made and the investment the government, it worked in conjunction rather than in isolation.
It's one area of government that's been quite refreshing to look at.
Okay, thank you. Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener. Dr Jennings, I'd like to go back to what you were discussing there. You've touched on what happens when FHI kind of refers something on to you. I wonder if you can take us through the key decision points from that, complaint to inspection to care notice to referral for prosecution, and explain why there have been no formal warning letters or referrals to prosecutors for farmed fish to date, despite the ongoing welfare concerns.
So when we receive complaints or any referrals from FHI, they're all processed through what we would call duty vet system. So they're received in and dealt with urgently within that day, usually with, well, I don't want to be bold, but usually within an hour they're treated as urgent. An initial triage is carried out on them, and they're assessed as to whether somebody needs to rattle out the door immediately within 24 hours, I can't remember exactly what the thresholds are. At that point, they are then passed to a local team. For APHA, most of the fish farms are within, and the fish facilities are within 3 of our offices, so Inverurie, Inverness and Perth. So they're passed to a fish-trained vet to assess, and at that point, further information will be got from as I said, local authority, FHI, other people who may have been involved in the decision in the farm already, and if it's possible, and it usually is, in contact with the local manager for that site. At that point, a decision is made about whether they will visit the site, and sometimes that can be substantially delayed. The reasons for that are because sometimes by the time we're receiving reports, especially if they come from the public, that action that has been observed is no longer in place, and sometimes the places are fallow, sometimes there's bad weather, sometimes these are quite inaccessible sites. So we get to them as quickly as we believe it to be needed. Once the inspection is in place and the person is on farm, to be clear, we have a right to visit. We have a right to access to data, a right to access to inspect. We haven't had any issues relating to access on any of these sites, just to be clear. At that visit or a remote inspection, we will look at data, assess whether mitigation, what has caused any issues, and it might not just be mortality, we have other reports coming in. And assess whether it's been resolved already, which it almost always has. If the company's aware of it, they will have resolved it, or whether they're moving towards resolving it. And we record all of that information on a specific form for fish welfare, and there will be things were marked as compliant or not compliant. If there are things that are non-compliant that are being moved towards, sometimes summary letters are written, and those will be circulated to potentially the local authority, usually the local manager or anybody else within the system that needs to receive those, and they're recorded on our system. In the majority of cases, the vast majority of cases, when dealing with salmon farms and salmon facilities, it is evident that already what is within the capability of the people within that site to make a change has been done. If on a rare occasion we turn up and something is awry and it appears that nothing has been done, at that point we will supply a letter that requires things to be done. Now, there's a separation between a letter which advises people of what we found and something called a care notice. A care notice is when we are not seeing any progress and we would then require by a time period for somebody to do something. It is vanishingly rare that we have to get to that point with salmon farms. They're incredibly compliant. So we have not had to take anybody to prosecution or refer people to the Procurator Fiscal because the cooperation and the aim to move towards compliance is, well, I don't want to say excellent, it's good. It's adequate for our requirements as a regulator.
Okay, thank you. Last year, there were 13 site visit reports for APHA. Are you able to share with us how many of those were conducted physically and how many were remote?
Give me a second.
Yeah, sure.
I have
if
that
you could
written down
also
somewhere.
just explain, how a remote visit happens and how you're able to, assess fish welfare and what's really going on the ground.
So, for remote visits, we will access all the data that we can get our hands on that are useful, including feed availability or mortality. We would also sometimes be able to access remote cameras, and that's often a really efficient way for us to look at fish, much more so than standing in a boat and trying to look in or standing on a dock to look in.
So were most of them remote? Would that be fair to say?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'll have to look it up.
Okay. So in November 2024, Cabinet Secretary Marie Goujon stated that APHA was increasing capacity and adding staff to undertake more work. How have those staff been deployed and how has that changed your capacity to go out and see what's happening?
So we had, right, I'll have to look up numbers, but we had 8 trained fish vets. To get vets to the point where they can do the initial triage, that would be all of our vets who are trained to the point where they can do welfare generally. So at the point where a vet is doing the duty vet rota, they would be expected to be able to manage the initial triage process. So that would be that. And they would be supported by a veterinary advisor. Our aim is to change from having just a small number of vets trained to having all of the vets within the areas where they could be deployed to fish farms to be trained. And that requires them going to a 2-day course in Stirling, doing a sea safety training course. And usually we get them, or almost always, I can't think of a vet recently that hasn't, they go out with FHI on one of the FHI's routine visits to familiarise themselves with different facilities. Does that answer your question?
I think so, yes. I think I'm still just trying to understand why so few visits compared to high mortality. I think, the comparison since 2022 is salmon mortalities have equated to approximately 1 in-person visit per 4.6 million fish deaths. And I just wonder if we're getting a full picture of welfare, if, as you say, by the time you get there, if it's been dealt with, it kind of feels like it's job done.
So for us we can do a lot of assessment using information that we can acquire from businesses. I guess, so your question is, why is it that we're not? Because we can see that something's being resolved without our requirement to go out. And by the time we would get there, often there are none of the fish that were involved in that mortality incident are still there, if that makes sense.
So does there need to be more proactive visualisation of what's happening if it's about not knowing what happened and how at the beginning, and by the time a report's been made, it's been dealt with and it's no longer an issue, which doesn't mean it wasn't an issue.
But the aim is for management of, as we've been talking about, there is an inevitability that incidents do happen. Mm-hmm. How we work to enforce welfare legislation, which we have available to us for farmed fish, is to ensure that people are acting in a way to prevent that happening again and to reduce the suffering on site as much as possible. That is often possible to assess without having to go and see the next batch of fish.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Tim Eagle.
Yeah, it was just around this. I'm conscious that in the papers we've got, actually, I think Salmon Scotland described or questioned why the committee had maybe not looked more into anti-salmon farming campaign groups and what that meant. And when we're talking about complaints and such, is there a risk, or do you think that there are more sort of vexatious complaints that are trying to close down the industry than perhaps genuine complaints, if that makes sense?
I really don't want to comment on that. We always treat all complaints completely neutrally.
Okay.
We take all of them at face value. If people are willing to have further conversations with us, we will speak to the complainant.
Yep.
I don't think we value judge them. We take them as what we are presented with. Does this appear to be a risk? Does there appear to be animal suffering at this moment? Did there appear to be animal suffering? Do we need to get out there very quickly and deal with it? Or does it appear that this has been resolved? Or actually, on looking into this, there was no problem? It's not... I don't think we take part in deciding whether or not the complaint we're receiving is vexatious.
And I appreciate that. And I guess every complaint has to be taken on the merits of what it comes in at. But I guess it would be interesting to know, wouldn't it, if the majority of complaints coming in from local people that have maybe seen something whilst out for a dog walk, or if actually most of it is coming in from larger groups that are acting on behalf of that group, or individuals that are working for a sort of lobby group, if you like. But you're not aware of that. You don't look at that when complaints come in. You never analyse in that way.
We don't. I can see who submitted the complaint, but I don't think it's appropriate for people who have submitted. What I want people to do in the public is to feel extremely welcome to contact APHA if they believe there are concerns relating to animal welfare within production animals, because that is our remit. I would rather have more reports that we triage out and are calm that there is no problem than not have people reporting. If you can see the...
I would agree with that. I just think there's we don't live in a simple world, do we? And actually, there is a complexity behind this, and we know, because we've had reports come in and various responses to consultations and that from certain groups that would argue strongly against the salmon farming industry. So it would be interesting to know, obviously, and based on some of the media online over the last couple of years as well. Sorry, Ben, did you want to come in as well, if that's right?
Well, just to help answer your question and support, I think that the system where anyone can make a complaint and it's triaged, and it's taken seriously instantly, is an important safety net. So we support that. Obviously, some of the complaints we're discussing it, we receive them, they're in the media. The vast majority of them come from animal welfare charities or wild fish associations, not from individual public seeing something and voicing concern. And in terms of the amount of resource that's spent on this, I've seen a report recently which actually tracks and traces the flow of money into activism against salmon farming. And the global spend was more than $250 million directed into it. So I think we have a problem here. I think 95%, actually 94% of the citizens of the British Isles want to eat animal protein, healthy, produced in the best possible way, which we do in Scotland. And I think a small minority, although I respect the life choices they make, want to channel energy and resources into influencing that. And I think the activism that's directed at salmon farming lost any form of balance several years ago. So, you know, we have to do our best in that landscape. But I would ask that the committee is aware to the fact that the amount of resource that's focused on this is huge. And it makes me sad, because actually I think that should go into conservation, into environment. Okay. And so the balance has been lost a long time ago.
Okay.
It's where I come from this as well, is the fact that APHA has not issued any formal warning letters, care notices and so on, is taken by some groups as some sort of cover-up, some sort of conspiracy, but it's not at all. From what we hear is you investigate them all on face value, you go through the process, and the result, the reason there hasn't been any formal letters, because there's been no need to do that.
I never want to say figures without having them directly in front of me. I think there's been one or two letters. I don't know whether we've had a care notice where there would be a time period placed on it. But no, I think that is a success, and it's not that APHA does not take formal proceeding. Well, we don't, but we take evidence to the local authority. I mean, luckily, fairly infrequently, but it's not that we don't, and it's certainly not the motivation of our officers by any means to not take forward if there were issues that we were observing, but we always hope that we get farmers and stock people and those involved in caring for their animals to move towards compliance. Our experience in the main with Scottish salmon farmers is that they've already moved themselves towards compliance. But we are aware that we need to keep an eye on it, and we do that.
Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. One of the committee's recommendations was that the Scottish Government bring forward additional regulations, and Amy, this is a question coming to you, so, that the Scottish Government bring forward additional regulations and official guidance under the Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act 2026. So my question is, in the absence of species-specific statutory welfare guidance for farmed fish and cleaner fish, I'd be interested to understand how APHA interprets and enforces the Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act in practice on salmon farms, and you might have uncovered that a bit in terms of your conversation with Emma Roddick, and if the lack of official guidance hinders APH's ability to take enforcement action.
So the description within the Welfare Act, in the Animal Health and Welfare Act, places the responsibility on the keeper to provide care that would be expected from somebody who knows what they're doing. If we were to find that people were not doing that, we would compile evidence and provide that to the Procurator Fiscal. Just to counter that, the welfare at the time of killing guidance that we have had, I went out with one of our our senior veterinary inspectors last week to a harvesting site, and it was extremely useful for me to be able to read that before we went and have some tram lines in which we could operate. For the other species that are farmed, there are detailed for some situations, there are detailed explanations of what is and isn't acceptable. As yet, we haven't had to try it. But if we were at the point where we were wanting to take forward a prosecution, we would collate the evidence that was available to us and take that forward. Whether or not it would limit us, I don't know. But I do understand that there's been information that we would carry it as what we find, we record it as we normally do through normal evidential process and take forward what we have.
Okay, thank you.
Now we have a question from Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. We've talked around the issue quite a lot today already of the extensive data that's out there and its importance in reassuring public. I wonder, maybe there's a question for either Amy or Peter, or possibly others. Do you see the data that's collected as being, or the categories of data that's being collected, likely to change in future? Are there areas of data gathering which you think will be new areas of data gathering which will be necessary in the future? Are there gaps in the current data? I'm thinking of things like the things that usually get attention around are culls, stocking mortalities, transport, things like that. I've no idea if this is necessary or not. I'm just asking the question, do you see the data gathered or the categories of data gathered changing in the future?
We find that the data that we have available to us is adequate for the requirements. I wouldn't like to comment on what would be needed for tracking through time. We deal with each incident as it is presented to us at each individual unit.
So I mean, things like unreported culls, I'm not.
If they're not reported to us, it wouldn't affect us because we have a right to access any data that the company has. So we don't need them to be transparent to do our. We don't need them to be in the public domain to do our job. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener.
I think the answer is similar in that at the moment we think that the data that we need to do our job is collected by us and made available, including on Scotland's Aquaculture website. However, this is a very dynamic and innovative industry. If it changes in the future and we need to get other information, we'll respond to that in due course.
Neil.
Thank you. Yeah, just to add that, as I said at the very beginning, the data we get for the FHI is suitable for the purposes we need to do it. So the things like culls and mortalities in the first 6 weeks of stock, and it's not necessary for us in terms of having that reported to us to deliver on the surveillance we do, but we do see that data and that information when we do our inspections and check all of the records on site. But there's possibly an area in terms of cleaner fish, and I think it's one of the recommendations that Scottish Government have agreed to take forward in terms of looking at more transparency and data around that in terms of mortality and unexplained losses. So we have agreed to take that forward. It's been slightly delayed. We were waiting for the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission's report to come out, and I think it was sensible to do that, to look at the recommendations of that, so that what we do take forward complements and matches that. But Cabinet Secretary will probably be able to say more on that recommendation going forwards. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Wells.
We may want to come back to this later on because it relates to escapes reporting, but there was a situation since the committee last met where approximately 80,000 fish escaped from a wellboat at sea, but that instance not recorded in the aquaculture database alongside other farm fish escapes because it's only escapes from farms which are recorded in that database. To our knowledge, no district salmon fishery boards or fishery trusts were notified at the time of that escape. There is a requirement in the Industry Code of Practice and a recommendation from the Fish Health Inspectorate that boards and trusts are notified. That's obviously an issue of transparency that we'd like to see resolved. It doesn't really matter to the wild environment whether fish escape from a farm or fish escape from a boat or something else. So there's obviously an issue there in terms of addressing that.
That's certainly an identified gap. We'll come back to escape fish later in a later question. Alistair, have you... Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Actually, your comments there, Neil, lead me on to my question quite nicely, because I was going to raise the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission's report, which highlights very high cleaner fish mortality, likely poor welfare as well, and recommends that better numbers are deployed and recovered, and ultimately phasing out the use of cleaner fish altogether. Without mandatory reporting of their losses, can yourselves and APHA face regulatory obstacles in ensuring that farms are meeting their welfare standards? And what practical obstacles does the industry face in adopting alternatives to cleaner fish?
Yep. So we do see the information, we do see the data in terms of mortality through our inspection process. And I think it's an issue in that it's in some situations it's difficult for the farm actually, I think, to maybe manage the cleaner fish stock. There's almost a disappearance of fish at the end of a cycle without really understanding why or how that's happened fully. I think there is a big variation between companies in terms of cleaner fish survival and the kind of care and effort they put into this, looking after the stocks. So there's maybe things that can be learned across the sector there from that perspective. But I think we need to go into that conversation with the sector to know what data they've got and what they can provide on a more regular basis, if that's a route that we go down. I think there's maybe practical difficulties sometimes in terms of recognising the loss of fish because of the system that you use to remove fish from, dead fish from a cage, and that cleaner fish can perhaps be hidden almost in terms of the other mortalities that are there on site. So there are maybe some practical issues around that too that need to be explored.
If we would treat them in the same welfare framework that we would do for any other farmed fish. Would welcome any extra information that we could have that would support us to regulate that.
Yeah, also from our point of view, we treat them with the same care and attention as we treat every salmon. And actually, you know, they do a very, very valuable biological sea lice control job for us. You know, everyone's seen sharks and rays that go to a specific part of a reef to benefit from cleaner fish. It's the same in salmon pens. It works. I'm uncomfortable with the level of mortality in cleaner fish. Part of that was because the development of it started in early 2000, and when AGD came in, you need to use fresh water to treat, and it's difficult to separate the cleaner fish from the salmon when you apply fresh water. So there's a lot of innovation and investment gone into separating them. And I think just to update, because of the development of fresh water and that becoming a dominant, very effective and environmentally friendly treatment for both AGD and sea lice, cleaner fish have become less important from a cleaner fish control perspective, particularly lump sucker, which are quite difficult to separate. So I think the industry in Scotland has almost entirely now moved away from stocking lump suckers. We suspended our breeding operation for them and diverted it to Ballan wrasse. And Ballan wrasse are very, very effective, and you can separate them quite easily to maintain the welfare through a treatment. So what we're seeing now is that the survival of Ballan wrasse is much higher. When we harvest salmon at the end, there's a lot of wrasse left over that we need to either humanely dispatch or try and take them back to the farms with disease checks and everything else in place. So the survival's increasing a lot. Mortality is still high. We need to get to a situation where the survival is increasing quicker, and we're farming Ballan wrasse so that we're not increasing the catch of Ballan wrasse from the wild. But I can assure you as a farmer, a biological tool to control sea lice that really works is very important.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context maybe, because we did report on this at the end of last year. So use of cleaner fish is, I think, unique in a production system where we take a sentient animal and we use it as a way of managing another animal. So there are ethical issues around that, but when we looked at the cleaner fish information that was out there, and you know, there is a separation between welfare, which is what the animal experiences, and the care and attention that people put into looking after them. And I don't doubt that. I mean, we saw really high levels of people working really hard to look after animals, dedicated cleaner fish, stock people on farm. And it has, you know, the effectiveness of looking after animals and their mortality has really dropped. And the farming, we visited farming sites, so we see the level of input. It doesn't mean that those animals don't have welfare issues because people are working really hard. You know, I think it's finding that balance. And one of the reasons that we were concerned about the cleaner fish is partly that ethical issue, but also because use of this animal is relatively new. There's a lot of work being done. There's a lot of movement in understanding the behavioural needs of these fish, and they're complex. They have complex social behaviours, they have complex environmental preferences and needs, and it is hard to provide that in a sea cage where I take that you care about those fish as well, but the primary purpose is to grow salmon, surely. That's your business, is to grow salmon. And where the cleaner fish needs may be harder to meet. We didn't recommend that cleaner fish should not be used because of the issues around the welfare of salmon with sea lice, and we can see even at low levels of infestation that causes welfare problems for salmon. It's great that there are other methods that are being now more widely used that maybe make cleaner fish less important, but from the welfare of the salmon perspective, when we weighed up the welfare of the cleaner fish and the welfare of the salmon, it is, as a biological control means, it is the least aversive for salmon to have cleaner fish. But if there are other methods that are becoming more effective, we would like to see the use of cleaner fish phased out. So the reason we didn't call for them to be no longer used was because we were concerned about the potential welfare impact for the salmon in the longer term. But there is an ethical concern around the use of a sentient animal to manage another animal.
And Ben, can you, when you respond, is it the industry's preference to move away from using cleaner fish and finding other ways to reduce the impact of sea lice? So you've talked about well boats or thermalisers and so on, and also aware that the fish that are then put into cages tend to be bigger now because they spend more time onshore. So when you respond to Cathy's comments, is it the general view of the industry that you want to move away from cleaner fish? And is that compatible when you're also looking to reduce emamectin and so on, chemical treatments and so on?
Yeah, I think a move away from cleaner fish would be premature and unjustified because they do work. And come on, it's no different to keeping bees in an orchard to fertilise apples. So it exists in many other forms of farming. I think you're right to emphasise that these are sentient animals and the welfare has to be the highest level and mortality should fall. Salmon farmers are trying to get a broad suite of treatment tools, biological, licensed veterinary medicines, fresh water increasingly, AI, even lasers, to shoot sea lice, really starting to work and being deployed throughout farms in Norway. So we want a very broad suite of treatment, but I understand your concerns about cleaner fish and I share them, but I think that the direction of travel with cleaner fish is very, very positive.
Emma, did you have a further comment?
So a quick one, if I can go back to Cathy. Does the Commission believe that mandatory standardised reporting of cleaner fish mortalities should be brought in, and should there be a requirement within that to record the cause of death rather than having all this unknown cause reporting that we have at the moment?
I think that's a general point that we would make actually across all livestock production systems, that lack of data is a real big issue with understanding welfare problems, understanding where they occur, so whether that's mortalities, but that can also be for other issues. So it would make it clearer and easier to progress if we had mandatory data reporting. I mean, I think often the voluntary can be really good, but mandatory just moves the bar up a little bit. I think understanding where those mortalities or why those mortalities occur is really important if we were to make progress in tackling the causes of mortality and then for improving welfare.
Just for timekeeping, I'm happy to ask Salmon Scotland to give a letter reporting the current state of cleaner fish and the development, and then also what can be done on the reporting voluntarily. We've got a productivity challenge as a country, so voluntary reporting rather than mandatory in legislation would be a good move.
Okay, thank you. Neil?
Yeah, and just on that point, actually, from a voluntary or mandatory perspective, we have the voluntary agreement in place in terms of salmon mortalities, salmonid mortalities across sites with those levels that people report to, and that works really well. There are some situations where reports are missed. There are some situations where reports are late, but generally they're of a lower percentage in terms of the total number of reports we receive. So there's good evidence there that a voluntary reporting system does work, and that might be an option within the cleaner fish information as we take that recommendation forward. But obviously, all options are on the table for the Cabinet Secretary to decide and take that forward. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. This question is for Ben, Peter, in the initial instance, and it's around the sea lice control measures, the current regime for monitoring sea lice, and I'd just be interested to get a sense from the industry if they think that regime is satisfactory.
Just before we'll answer that, we're very aware that there's a current ongoing legal proceedings, and we appreciate that you may not be able to be in a position to answer the questions as fully as you may like, but the committee appreciate that.
Yeah, I can try and speak as freely as I like about it, but the idea that you would have a model which predicted the accretion or lice pressure on a wild salmon smolt going through a sea loch or a fjord or an estuary, and you would end up with a tool like Depamod, which essentially, as you probably know...
A tool like what?
Depamod. You know?
No.
Okay, so there's a big debate many years ago about the extent of impact on the seabed of carbon enrichment, and SEPA, with the industry, developed a tool which was reasonably accurate and validated, which showed the spatial extent on the seabed. Yes. Took the debate right away, took the heat right out of it. So we wanted to have a model that would do the same. And unfortunately, the model architecture was set so precautionary that it over-predicted to a factor of 4 or 5 times. We tried to work with SEPA, we tried to work with FMS. They were hell-bent on making that architecture unreasonably and unrealistically precautionary, and eventually the industry, much to my regret, had to appeal against that because the model was so inaccurate that no reasonable person would be able to accept it. And I think that's really unfortunate, because it would have been a big step forward if we'd just taken actually what was ministerial advice, because I was in a meeting where 2 senior ministers actually suggested to SEPA that they should have a pilot study, they should go through a thorough validation, they should show that it was accurate, and then roll it out as regulation. And SEPA, I think, because of pressure from other organisations, took a route to go forward into full regulation with a model which was grossly inaccurate and no one could accept. Okay. And it's really a shame.
Thanks. Peter.
Apologies to convener, I won't be able to comment on that specific question because of legal proceedings. I provided some information in our written submission. That doesn't address your particular question, and I can talk to my legal team back at SEPA and respond in writing if there's anything we can add on that at this time.
Okay, so I just want to confirm you can't respond to my question if you think the current regime, SEPA's current regime for monitoring sea lice is satisfactory. You can't respond to that question.
The current regime is under appeal.
Okay, thank you.
Obviously, I'm not going to comment on the substance or the legal merits of the appeals, but I do want to just talk a little bit about the sort of downstream effect of those appeals, because they have real practical and ecological consequences. As a sector, we don't feel that there's adequate protection in place at the moment to minimise the risk posed by farm-derived sea lice to wild fish. Those appeals could take many months or even years, and during that time, wild salmon and sea trout remain exposed to sea lice pressures during the smolt run. No material effort has been made to reduce risk, for example, through interim protection measures through these prolonged legal processes. And wild salmon and sea trout smolts continue to migrate past farms, both last spring and most likely this spring coming. So in the context of a species in crisis, inaction during these appeals isn't a neutral position at all. It carries ecological consequences, and we need to be cognizant of that. One of the things that was really regrettable during that process was that the salmon farming sector didn't proactively engage with us at all prior to submitting those appeals. And indeed, it took over 4 months for them to meet with us to explain their rationale behind those appeals. We're a key stakeholder in this space. We have a key interest in what's happening, and it shows a lack of regard, actually, for the wide range of interests in this space.
Ben?
I have discussed this many times in great detail over many years, and I think that's a deliberate exaggeration and a very polarised view. I think the architecture was deliberately made so that it was unrealistic, so that it was highly penalised. And to reference ecological consequences when the sea lice levels have dropped year on year and the control has improved vastly, even escapes, which, yeah, we had one last year, but the level of escapes is at the lowest level for decades, the lowest level of sea lice for decades. So the risk is minimal. I think exaggerating this and trying to force through models that are unrealistic is unhelpful, and that's primarily why we're in this situation.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Just further to that.
Yeah.
So if we control sea lice properly and diminish the numbers of sea lice, then actually concerns about smokes going past and picking up sea lice isn't really, hopefully, going to be an issue in the future if we do that right.
Yeah, I mean, that's the prize in managing the environmental potential hazards of this sector, to get escapes down to zero, or to find a way to sterilise farm fish that's such that there's no interaction, or to keep sea lice levels so low and farm in the right locations that there is not a measurable hazard to wild fish. And the model, if done properly, would have really helped do that. Of course, the farmers have taken sea lice levels down to unnaturally low levels. Like a wild fish will have 5, 10 plus sea lice when it returns to a river. A farm fish has 0.4 from the data that we see at the moment. So they're already at unnaturally low levels, but of course, to be fair to Alan, there's a lot more farmed fish than there are wild fish. So the farmers are doing that, taking the levels down as quickly as possible. That has increased mortality previously, but the new innovation and development around well boats and freshwater has slowed that mortality. But what we really need was an accurate model that can take the heat out of this situation. And it may lead to some very practical discussions, like should fish farms be relocated, or is these areas shouldn't be any further development, or should they be managed different? And then a big change that's come in is the 1 year at sea, the post-smolt, which, Karina, you referenced before. And that's changed things dramatically. You know, that's when fish are at sea for 11 months and then they're harvested at 5 kilos. And sea lice just don't get time to establish and become an issue, because it doubles the amount of fallowing that you had previously. So,
I'll come back on some of those points. I don't think for a second that we're exaggerating the situation. I accept what Ben's saying in terms of the sea lice control, in terms of lice per fish is reducing, but as Ben suggested there, it's not the lice per fish that's important to the wild environment. I mentioned this the last time I was in front of the committee. It's the overall burden of lice that are released into the environment that's important, and with more and more farm fish in the sea, we need to take that very seriously. There's another downstream effect of these appeals that I just wanted to bring to the attention of the committee, because Scottish Government took a decision a while back to advise local authorities not to impose environmental management plans on farms that are consented. And the logic behind that sound, there shouldn't be double regulation, but we don't have a sea lice framework in place at the moment because of the appeals. So we have new consents that are granted without environmental management plan conditions, which include monitoring of sea lice and things along those lines. SEPA's full national monitoring framework is not yet operational, and there's been a judicial review in relation to that, as we found out from the SEPA letter to the committee. And there's no clearly articulated contingency mechanism to ensure equivalent protections are in place. So I don't want to speculate as to where we end up with the appeals, but if the appeals result in a position where the sea lice regulatory framework is quashed, Scotland could find itself in a position where there's actually fewer protective measures in place for wild fish because EMPs have been taken away, environmental management plans. So really what we're seeking at the moment is assurance that, irrespective of the outcome of those appeals and the judicial review, we won't end up in a position in Scotland where there's actually reduced monitoring, weaker policy oversight, diminished safeguards for wild fish compared to the situation before SEPA took responsibility for sea lice. And at the moment, we don't have that assurance.
Okay, thank you. I'm minded to suspend the meeting for a comfort break for 5 minutes, and if we return at 10:40. Thank you. Suspend the meeting. I'll now move to Beatrice Witcher for further questions. Thank you, Beatrice.
Thanks, Convener. We've already touched on the impact of warming seas and how climate change is affecting disease outbreaks, harmful algal blooms and parasite infestations on salmon farms. So my question is, do you think the Scottish Government is doing enough to support scientific research into how climate change is affecting the issues that affect salmon farms?
Kick off with Ben.
Yeah, I think, to be fair to the government on this occasion, they have done quite a lot. You know, climate resilience is something that we're all having to face into. But parasite levels have dropped massively. Disease levels, both bacterial and viral, are down considerably in the Scottish industry. The big challenge in recent years has been micro jellyfish and algae, which are a factor of the warming seas, particularly in summer. And then amoebic gill disease, which is a problem because up until this year, temperatures for a while have not dropped below 8 degrees, and at 8 degrees it goes dormant. It doesn't go away, but it stops multiplying. So I think the situation currently is much better because the temperature in the sea is about 7.5 degrees, and mortality is very low, and AGD is stationary. But I think more research on how to predict challenges from algae and jellyfish would be beneficial. And back to, you know, this is the UK's largest food export, putting £1 billion into the economy with an average wage of £44,500. So it's really important to the economy of the islands and the west coast of Scotland that we get ahead of this and take mortality down further.
And what about sort of early warning tools? Is there any research into that kind of thing that you're aware of?
Yeah, there's a lot of research into it, and where people are using AI to identify water quality on a daily basis or twice daily or often on an hourly basis, that's really helping predict when these things arrive at low levels.
Yeah.
Neil?
Yeah, just to add to what Ben said there, the Scottish Government have published its areas of research interest document. That was last year, and within that there's a lot of themes that you've mentioned there in terms of health of aquaculture animals, jellyfish, algal blooms, and that type of area. So it's really a document that seeks collaboration in terms of research. So it's identifying the areas that are important to the government in terms of where more answers are required or more research is required to be undertaken, and then seeking agreement and uptake from others and third parties on that to try and coordinate and collaborate. Thanks.
Anybody else? Oh.
No, it's fine.
Rhoda Grant.
Thank you. Just on the same subject, we're kind of aware of some of the threats, especially with warming waters. But I wonder what research has been carried out into future threats that haven't maybe appeared yet. Are we looking at algae, toxins, whatever, that are present in waters further south that might have an impact on salmon in the future, given that we're finding waters warming? Is any of that work being done, or are we just dealing with threats as they appear?
That fish species are moving further north faster than changes in the land environment that we see. You know, so 50 years ago, Iceland was a curiosity if you caught mackerel. Now it's the largest fishery in the world for mackerel. The wild salmon is under pressure for sure in the British Isles and in Europe, but it's actually moving its range further north into places like Greenland, Iceland, Cold Peninsula, etc. So they're moving further north. So the same pressures that are affecting wild stock are affecting farm stock, with species from the Channel becoming prevalent most of the summer, jellyfish I'm talking about here, on the west coast. And I think understanding them, understanding the spatial extent and the concentration and the toxicity, how to predict them and how to help fish survive in those new challenging conditions is a lot more work required there. But we have made positive steps, and the mortality From jellyfish, we're able to mitigate that to a greater extent now using exclusion barriers and actually moving fish when these jellyfish come in.
Thanks.
Just on the innovation, again, our previous work identified that there were significant investments in innovation and science, whatever, to improve or reduce mortality and disease and so on. But one of the criticism was that perhaps industry just wasn't keeping up with pace with the rapidly changing environment that fish farms found themselves in. Do you feel that the industry has now got the tools to actually keep up with that rate of change in the environment that it sees, and in the future we will see a reduction in mortality because of jellyfish, micro-jellyfish, or fungal disease, or events that are down to water warming?
Yeah, as I confirmed to you before, and I'm happy to, again, write and reference this with evidence, but viral, bacterial, parasitic challenges are quite considerably down in recent years. When the change was quite rapid, in 22 and 23, the marine heat wave that was documented off the west coast of Scotland was like +4 degrees in the sea. And I don't think anybody expected that to be so extreme so rapidly. So the industry has had to invest and move extremely quickly to innovate and get these resources in place. But there has been a lag time. So it takes 3 years to build a modern wellboat, and the cost to lease it is around £10 million per year. So it's taken time for that equipment to be deployed. It is now being deployed on a greater and greater scale, and the results are encouraging. But mortality needs to be lower from my perspective.
Okay, thank you. One scientific improvement certainly that offers a huge number of positives when it comes to transparency and so on is the DNA-based seabed monitoring, which we're hoping to see rolled out, I believe, this spring. Can I ask Peter, how many sites will that advancement in DNA-based monitoring, how many sites will that increase by that SEPA can actually monitor and increase or improve your ability to act on non-compliance?
Yeah, so this is a DNA-based monitoring of the seabed to pick up the impact of deposition and make sure it's within the allowed mixing zone levels. So at the moment, the existing method is quite limited and it only applies to certain muddy seabed types. The new method will apply to pretty much all seabed types that you can get in a grab. So that will enable us to use that method to assess compliance with the majority of sites. And the big advantage of it is the analytical time is very much reduced. It normally takes us 3 days approximately to do one grab sample. Almost the sky's the limit. 3 days you can do as many as the machine can hold. So it really speeds up the assessment time and allows us to get back in touch with the operator very, very quickly if there's an issue.
So can you give us an indication of the scale of improvement that we're looking at? So there were concerns over the number of sites that were being sampled and how long it was taking, that we weren't getting a proper view on actually whether we're in. So what sort of scale, if you can give us an example of what kind of figures we're looking at?
So where we're using it, once we've collected the data from the farm, so our boats have gone out, we've collected the sample, we've brought it back to the lab. Previously, it might take us, you would probably do most of the analysis in the winter time, and it would take 3 or 4 months to do the whole lot. Now, we could do that in 3 weeks or so from collecting the sample. So it's a very significant shortening of the time to get the results.
But what is that? How is that reflected in the number of sites that you're actually able to monitor, rather than how quickly you can turn them round?
Well, the monitoring still requires us to go out to the site, and this year we've sampled 26 of the active sites, and that's around what we aim to do each year. So it doesn't affect that. The constraint on that is the number of sites we get to, and we think that sort of figure, about 10% to 15%, is the right number to do that detail. the operators also have to carry out the monitoring, and this method is also open to them. The new method will be open to them by the spring, and we hope there will be a wide adoption of that, because that will shorten their times to get the results and be very extensively used then by the operators. That's our hope.
Yeah. So this should be really positive in terms of also adding a bit more transparency around how the industry operates. So it should be welcome. But are there any other new insights that this DNA sampling will bring to help, assessments of sites and maybe the siting of fish farms in the future?
I think a parallel bit to this is we're also working on this method doesn't apply to all seabed types. So if the seabed around the farm is rocky, or there's a protected species like marl that you don't want to grab at all, it doesn't work there. So what we're doing at the moment is we've got funding through the Scottish Government CivCheck Challenge Programme, Programme 11, to get a contractor, a researcher, to develop a method that will be almost seabed type independent, and that will allow us to hopefully get a method that can address a wider range of seabed types as well. I think that's the aim there. So with the two methods then, it would have coverage across all sites, and whether that second method will allow us to potentially better understand effects on things like marl beds, so which we don't have a good way of monitoring at the moment.
Okay. And from the industry's perspective, is this a positive move forward? Will it once again help build public confidence?
Yeah, respectfully, I maintain that public confidence is high in demand for salmon, etc. So anything more that can be done on the environmental impact of salmon farming is a good thing. It's unfortunate that even during COVID, when salmon farmers were allowed to hold more biomass on the farms to manage through that difficult period, the actual compliance on seabed improved. But because of the backlog, and when SEPA changed its regulation, it increased massively the amount of samples that had to be taken within a fixed period, and it just couldn't be done. So a number of farms were forced into non-compliance simply because of that change in the capacity. So if this unblocks that, then it will speed the whole thing up, and it will show what we know is the case, that salmon farms on seabed are increasingly compliant, and that will further support public confidence.
Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. So the committee made a recommendation that the Scottish Government establish a research project focused on testing and improving the modelling of environmental conditions that are known to cause high mortality events. You can see that there's that the government has started to work on that with the area of research interest paper, identifying the priority research needs. But I wonder if you could give us a sense of what has actually changed on the ground as a result. For example, could you help us understand how close this work is to influencing day-to-day farm management decisions, or where are we at in that space? Who wants to pick that up?
It could be one for either industry or
just
regulator.
Help a bit, and then Neil can have time to think about his answer, I guess. So we talked before that fish farmers use only a relatively small fraction of their allowed consent, so they're already selecting
A fraction of their what?
I
just didn't hear you.
Yeah, of the consent, the production biomass.
Okay.
Fish farmers using a relatively small amount of that because they're already selecting the best farms that they believe give the water quality and the highest welfare, the best rearing conditions. So that's ongoing. I think if the government and Marine Directorate can come in and hone in on farms which do have persistently high mortality, and that's shown to be environmental conditions and it's not farming practices, I think in some way that exonerates the farmer to an extent, and there should be a bit more empathy about how to fix that situation, and then a slightly more flexible regulatory system that would allow a farmer to look for a relocation and farm in a better location. That would be highly beneficial, I think.
But what you're talking about is in the future, so nothing has actually changed on the ground since we made that recommendation a year ago, over a year ago.
Ms Burgess, this is a very fast-moving industry. Everything changes on the ground very quickly. Everyone's focused on trying to improve the situation urgently. So there's a lot of change here.
but you were describing you were saying if something could happen in the future. I'm just trying to get a sense. We made a number of recommendations. We're having this inquiry more than a year since we did that work. I'm just trying to get an understanding of what's actually happening on the ground. So that was really helpful. What you described is what you would like to see happening on the ground. I just wonder, for others, is there anything that's actually happening yet, or is it something that's going to be into the future in terms of the targeted research into modelling environmental conditions that lead to high mortality events? Are we actually doing anything yet on that?
Yeah, so from a fish health inspector perspective, we've been involved in the persistent elevated mortality analysis work, but we're not really actively involved in other research processes and things like that. So I'll maybe defer to Cabinet Secretary in terms of updates on those specific recommendations. But in terms of the persistent elevated mortality, I gave a bit of a description of that before in terms of where we're at. We've worked really at pace to produce something that's quite robust, scientifically driven, involving, as I say, FHI, policy and science colleagues. But we need to ground truth the output of that in terms of having conversations with the sector, because the information, we need more information basically around the mortality to answer the question of persistent elevated mortality. So we're at that point now, and we're almost at the point of the report going to committee on that. In terms of the outcomes of that, that'll be for the Cabinet Secretary and Scottish Government to determine, how we use that output in terms of, what it means practically for that fish farm and that location. So that conversation is still to be had in terms of output.
Okay, thanks.
Tweed, because I know she's got a question on this exact topic.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, it's a question for Peter, to go back to the enhanced seabed monitoring. Peter, what's the format of the published results going to look like? Is it going to be something that's easy for communities and stakeholders to understand and be able to get to grips with, rather than just compliance or non-compliance? You're smiling. This is interesting.
Yeah. We can look at that. At the moment, we generally just report whether the seabed survey is compliant or not compliant.
Yep.
We can look at whether there's options to provide different types of information around that as part of the digital project we talked about earlier, where we're looking at how to improve information to the public. So I hadn't heard that there was a need for that, but I think that, having mentioned that, we'll explore that as part of that process to see if the information beyond just straightforward pass-fail type information is valuable.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that's important, for communities and stakeholders to understand exactly what's going on. So if you can look at it that way.
That'd be fine. Take that away.
Okay. Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. I'm aware that the industry has been working to reduce antibiotic use. I think that was possibly alluded to earlier on. There have obviously been instances where individual companies have had to report figures and then re-report figures about the levels of antibiotic use. I wonder if any of you could say a bit more about the direction of travel on antibiotic use, and also what enforcement steps would normally follow for any dispute about returns in this area.
Ben?
Yeah, I think you have to start with the context that antibiotic use in aquaculture is absolutely minimal. It's at the lowest level compared, as I said before, to humans, companion animals, sheep, cattle, beef, etc. So it has been falling, but there was a mistake made last year which was indicative of the level of scrutiny on the industry, where some numbers were missed. That was very swiftly corrected. I think the rate of vaccine innovation and development is very high in Scotland. So we're making various vaccines, including autogenous vaccine, which you probably know is when you culture that from the animal or the serum. So I expect antibiotic use to fall markedly in the coming years, and I think if Scotland can get down to a level where it's zero, like it is in Faroes and like it is in Norway, then that would further improve public confidence. But it's at a minuscule level, and all fish harvesting have either below the MRO or very often non-detectable levels. So in terms of microbial resistance, I don't it's obvious an area of concern because we look after it, but it's not a big area of concern compared to other uses.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Anyone else?
Peter, did you want to come in?
Just to confirm that what Ben says is that 2024 was the lowest year in terms of antimicrobial use reported, and 2025, I haven't got the full data yet, but it looks like it was a similar low level.
Thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Just on that under reporting, I hear, Ben, that it was acted upon swiftly, but there is a concern, and we kind of talked earlier about reporting issues around mortalities. Now we've got this this other reporting issue, and I just wonder how the committee can have 100% confidence, because this one was found out through work being done, but do we have confidence that actually we are getting an accurate picture of reporting?
Can I just come in there, Convener, in that the information reported to SEPA and published by SEPA through Scotland's Aquaculture website didn't have errors in it. It was correct.
Okay, but there was reporting by the sector that was inaccurate.
Yeah, it's just a simple mistake in a very large data set that's released. It was accepted and corrected very quickly. I think you should...
Okay, that's enough. Thank you very much.
Did you want to continue?
I just think Scotland leads the world in transparency on aquaculture. You can go in, you can look at densities, you can look at medicine use, you can look at antibiotic use, and I totally understand and respect the fact that you want approval on that. But I think that we should just take stock for a minute and understand that we do lead the world in transparency on salmon farming, because it's a good thing. Did you want to come back to me?
I mean, I would be concerned about that. I mean, my sense is that we may lead the world on a kind of transparency, but I think what's coming up here is that, and it's what came up in the work that we did previously, that there are kind of points where responsibility ends and something doesn't get picked up. So I have concerns about that. We've got a number of recommendations that we've made from our report, and as I'm having this conversation today, I'm not getting a sense that enough has changed over the course of the year.
Okay, thank you. A question from Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to go to yourself, Dr Wells, about escapes, which came up slightly earlier on. The Scottish Government's, of course, a signatory to NASCO's commitment to achieve 100% containment of farmed salmon, but revisions to the 2015 technical standard and the introduction of financial penalties are not expected until 2026-27 and 27-28. So how does that pace of action in Scotland compare to other NASCO signatories, and is that pace of action consistent with our international obligations?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. We've got a new reporting system happening through NASCO, which is just kicking off this year. It's fair to say that most signatories to NASCO that have aquaculture within their jurisdiction are unable to show adequate progress in the way that NASCO does the reporting for that, for either the international goals regarding escapes or sea lice. And Scotland's Scotland's the same as everyone else in that. We're obviously concerned about escapes. We absolutely accept that the number of farmed escapes is low, is lower than it has been, but it's still high in comparison with the number of wild fish that we have in the environment, and that's actually the proper metric. It's the number of escaped farmed salmon relative to the abundance of wild salmon, and then it's the downstream impacts of those escapes. Now, we don't see impacts every time there's an escape necessarily. It depends at what stage of production the fish in the cages are and whether they're ready to move into rivers and interbreed and all the rest of it. But as I think we reported the last time, the National Electrofishing Programme for Scotland already has demonstrated widespread presence of genetic material from farm fish in wild populations. We find that in the areas of Scotland where there is fish farming. We don't find that in the areas of Scotland where there isn't fish farming. And that includes freshwater production in rivers on the East Coast. They're the only areas on the East Coast where we see that level of genetic integration. But it's not just about genetic integration, it's competition for space and resources as well. So even if you don't have interbreeding, the fact that there are farmed fish in the environment is not a good thing. It's not a good thing for the farmers, it's not a good thing for wild fish. So we absolutely want to see more action in that space. There have been, over the last 5 years, around about 150,000 fish that have escaped from cages, and unfortunately, the majority of those have come from Maui farms. So we need to understand why that's happening. Obviously, we have situations with storms and things like that, but that's we talked about climate change earlier on. That's the environment in which we'll increasingly be working. Absolutely do want to acknowledge that Maui responded very quickly. For example, last year when there was the large incident, and has gone on to fund substantial post-event monitoring and work to understand what's going on, which is great. We'd like to see that as obviously we don't want to see escapes in the first place, but that sort of response is what we would like to see as an industry standard. We've talked about escapes in the marine environment, and that's very often the focus, is escapes in the marine environment. But we talked at the last session in 2024 about failures in the freshwater environment. We think that's a real and an ongoing issue, and we haven't seen significant progress to address some of those issues. There has been some discussions with Highland Council about a particular point that we mentioned. There has been a little bit of progress there, but that actually took a formal complaint to Highland Council from one of our members to actually make that happen. With regard to the penalty system, at the previous evidence session, we highlighted the lack of progress in moving forward the Salmon Interactions Working Group recommendations. And since then, the Scottish Government established a steering group early last year to explore possible options. So we were a part of that group, and it was a good process, an inclusive and collaborative process. And it provided an opportunity for stakeholders to come round the table on that basis. Unfortunately, with some staff moving on, that has halted. So we're encouraged that commitment is still there. But in the interim, we've been committing to work with the salmon farming sector to try and develop a mutually agreed approach to introducing a voluntary penalty system for farm fish escapes. So we want to do that together. We want to come up with a mutually agreed approach that both sectors can buy into, and we'll see how we get on with that.
I want to ask about the escape last October, the Gorston farm. I wondered if there are structural failures that have been identified since that escape to allow the industry and regulators to look at preventing that from happening again.
I should maybe let Ben answer that question.
Would you like me to answer that question?
Well,
only if you want.
Go for it.
It's the worst storm that I've seen in Fort William in terms of damage, and we acted quickly. We apologised for it. I called John Gibb on the Saturday morning, within minutes after I knew that it had occurred. There was strong winds. There was a tidal surge, and it pushed the group onto a flotation tube, and that tube made a hole in the pen. We tried to get the pen up and recover it, but by the time we did, 75,000 out of 82,000 fish had escaped. The fish were 960 grams, so they were immature. Some of them went into the rivers and then come out of the rivers. I spoke to John about that, so there's nothing seen in the river now. We suspect that the predation levels will be extremely high and very few of them will return. It'll probably look a little bit like Carradale, but to support that, we have put in place a 2-3 year genetic study to measure the level of integration. It was a bad day. It was a significant storm. In terms of, Al made a comment that, I think you said the majority, but you said many of the escapes are with Maui. I take that because Maui's got the most fish and the most farms, so that would be common sense. But we've also had a policy of not expanding or developing any new locations in what we agree with our wild fish neighbours as sensitive locations. So we have gone to open sea locations, and whilst they are beneficial for the environment in terms of lice control and water quality for the fish, it is a very challenging environment during a storm, and so we've had to balance that, and the main way of balancing is equipment investment, the highest specification kit you can put in. Sorry, Convener.
Thanks. Yeah, just to confirm that under the Aquaculture and Fisheries Scotland Act 2007, the Fish Health Inspector got powers to inspect farms in relation to containment, escapes, risk of escape and so forth. And we did do an inspection of the site to which you refer, undertook that and made some recommendations in terms of the design and the installation of the equipment. And that was being put to Maui and those recommendations have been met. So just to clarify that from our perspective.
Good, thank you. I also wanted to ask, given the salmon were being treated with antibiotics, has the Fish Health Inspectorate assessed the impact of that or potential impacts on wild salmon, the risk of antimicrobial resistance transfer, predator exposure?
So from the antibiotic perspective, we don't really have a regulatory remit as such. That would fall more to the Veterinary Medicines Directorate and perhaps to SEPA too. We do undertake residue testing on behalf of the VMD, the Veterinary Medicines Directorate. We've purely got the contract to do that sampling and submit those to the VMD for analysis. We will inspect medicine records on site as part of that process. We don't collect a comprehensive record of all the medicines that have been used. We're really checking that farmers are maintaining the appropriate records on site. So in terms of these specific fish, I would have to go back and check my notes or our notes from that perspective.
It would be good then to hear from yourself, Peter, if there has been any such review or assessment made and you know, ecological assessment overall of the impact of that escape.
We have not carried out any ecological assessment to date, other than the work that Alan and Ben have referred to, which we'd be interested in seeing the findings of. In terms of antimicrobial resistance, we don't have a direct role there. There is a Scottish AMR strategy. I would point out that these are cold-blooded animals, so the bacteria that they support are not normally expected to be pathogens of warm-blooded animals like humans. But I can provide further information on that if it's helpful.
Does it feel right that the onus and the responsibility of regulating this seems to be falling on the industry rather than anybody else?
In terms of escapes? Yeah,
and the potential antimicrobial resistance impacts, the impact on wild salmon, the impact on the ecology of the wider area?
Yeah, so it's not, I mean, the regulation enforcement is with Marine Directorate Fish Health Inspectorate.
I think both of you, though, have said, you know, antimicrobial, antibiotics, this isn't us.
Yeah. So I'm not sure there is an issue with the antimicrobial resistance element, so we need to come back to you on that, but we're not aware of a big pathway to AMR risk to humans. For that.
I'm going to bring in Ben and then Neil.
Yeah, but I think with a great deal of respect, you've already sort of been explained that the risk to any antimicrobial resistance is minuscule or non-existent. The fish on site had been treated with antibiotics, but it was calculated that the level of antibiotics were below the MRL, below the minimum level that you should have. And
but calculated by whom, I suppose, is my question.
Well, calculated by professional veterinarians that are able to do that, working within the company. And then, in addition to that, the fish that remained in the pen were tested, and because there was 5,000 left, remember, and they were significantly below the minimum residue level. So it's not an issue, but I can understand why activist campaigning organisations would try and present it as an issue. But I think what's being said is the checks and balances and proper steps and thorough analysis, and it was not an issue.
It sounds to me as somebody trying to scrutinise the impact of regulation on the industry and the industry's best practice, that it is, you're marking your own homework here.
respectfully, again, no, I can't understand why you think it's such a big issue. I'm happy to write to you and set it all out in detail with the analysis and what was done. And I hope after receiving that letter, you can also understand that it's a non-issue.
Yeah,
But I respect your right to question and ask, and it's fine.
Yeah, I'm not stating that there's an issue or there's not.
Yeah.
But what I don't see is any oversight or independent.
I think what you can see is that there is huge oversight and scrutiny on this industry, and it has its challenges and it's steadily improving. And we welcome the scrutiny when it's balanced. When it's accusations of, you know, risk to microbial resistance from this, I think that's hammed up to the point of not being credible. But I respect your right to ask those questions, and I'm happy to write and take you all through the detail and hope that that's sufficient for you.
Great.
Peter and Neil.
Just to pick up on the antimicrobial resistant issue, there's a UK and a Scottish action plan there, and that is looking and has looked at the risk pathways for AMR to people. And I don't have that information with me, but I can provide that to you. And it has looked at different routes through livestock, including fish, but also land-based mammals. So I can provide that, and that's the information, and that's the evidence base we would look to.
Neil?
Right, so just to pick up on Ben's point in terms of, antibiotic use, it is done under veterinary advice. So it's really controlled. Vets follow appropriate codes of practice for that. So it's really controlled from that perspective. But also from the Veterinary Medicines Directorate sampling that we do, they publish all of the results in terms of residue testing in relation to farmed fish. They're available on the website, and it's really very rare that a residue is picked up. And often it's explainable as to why that's been found at that occasion.
Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. I'm going to direct my question initially to Dr. Alan Wells. So earlier you said that, I'm going to paraphrase you, wild salmon are a species in crisis, and inaction isn't a neutral position. And so the committee, there are many measures responding to the 2018 REC committee, and then additional recommendations from this committee from our work on wild and farm salmon interactions that could be considered a work in progress. And for example, one of our recommendations was that we recommend an immediate end to the sighting of farms in the close vicinity of known migratory routes for wild salmon, and the Scottish Government didn't accept that recommendation. But I'd be interested to hear from you, what should change to deliver meaningful risk reduction for wild salmon, these species in crisis?
So there's a lot in that. I mean, the last time I sat in front of this committee, I was talking about the sea lice risk framework. I was talking about some of the things that we thought were good about that, and some of the things that we had concerns about. I think a proper regulatory system that meets the tests set out in the Salmon Interactions Working Group of being robust, transparent, enforceable, and enforced is absolutely key to this. And we can have all sorts of discussions about what that looks like, but I think SEPA were broadly along the right lines in trying to manage the overall number of lice within the environment. The recommendation about migration routes is a really interesting one, and one that I can absolutely understand and see where it comes from. But because sea lice are, I'm coming at this from the perspective of thinking about sea lice here. Because sea lice have a planktonic stage, the actual point where the interaction might take place could be quite distant from the farm, depending on local sea conditions and all the rest of it. So understanding through modelling where those lice go and managing the risk at the point where those lice go is another really important element of the framework. And one of the things that we like about the framework, should it go forward, is it will allow us to identify lower risk sites to put farms in place and hopefully avoid high risk sites for new farms. So in some ways the sea lice risk framework, if it goes forward in future once the appeals are through, will help to address those issues. At the moment, because of the situation we find ourselves in, there is no progress towards that.
you keep saying if it goes forward, so what's stopping the framework from going forward?
There's 260 appeals of conditions in farm licences that have been
and that's
put forward.
specifically on the framework?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else that you think needs to change?
I mean, there's a whole host of things. We're going to put some written evidence in probably next week. So I'm very happy to cover that off in written evidence to the committee. But there, I think if we can get a suitable regulatory framework in place for sea lice, then that will address an awful lot of the issues that were identified in the committee.
Thanks.
We want to, I'm a fisherman, I care about wild fish, Alan knows that. We want to work with you. We prefer a situation where we can work together rather than have bureaucratic legislation. I personally think that FMS should put more into conservation in this country. I think that a rod licence is important. I think that index rivers are important. I think that much more should be done there. But we're happy to work with you on our sector.
It's almost becoming a little bit of a meme here. I would be very happy if this committee decided in its legacy report to recommend that there should be a further investigation on wild salmon and how we manage them and all the rest of it. I'd be very, very open to that sort of a discussion in the next session. I'm very happy to lay all of that, all of that stuff out. You mentioned a rod licence, for example. As part of the wild salmon strategy, we've just made some recommendations to the Scottish Government, which does include a rod licence, for example. So there are a whole host of processes which often seem to be either ignored or misunderstood by the sector, which are taking place all the way across the piece to try and address all of the pressures that wild salmon face. But I'm talking today about sea lice and escapes because that's the scope of this inquiry.
I can assure you that there was a desire for this committee, and if I remember the previous Environment Committee that I was involved in, to do a piece of work on wild salmon, because I think we all appreciate the pressures come from different places, and certainly as the convener I was keen to ensure that the focus wasn't particularly on one aspect of the pressure, but as I'm quite sure you're aware that the committee has come under significant pressures to deal with other issues and pieces of legislation. That was not something we could do this year, but I'm quite sure when we come on to discuss a legacy paper at the end of this meeting that we'll bear that in mind. I'm now going to move on to our final theme, which is on spatial planning, consenting and community benefit. Before I do that, I want to put on record my extreme disappointment that Highland Council and Shetland Islands Council were asked to take part in this round table to give a local authority's perspective, given how important their role is in the consenting of farms, but neither sent any representatives. So that, unfortunately, is a bit of a gap in some of the evidence we could have taken today. So just wanted to put that on record. I'll invite Beatrice Wishart to ask her question.
Thanks, Convener. So my question is around the consenting pilots that SEPA and Industry and Shetland Islands Council have been involved in. So could you say what may have improved for applicants and what changes might still need to be made to make the process more efficient and coordinated?
I think they've been disappointingly slow because it was supposed to speed up and increase both the scrutiny and the process time. There are people in Maui and the sector that know more than I do about it. So could I write to you and just clarify our full view on that?
That would be helpful.
Peter.
So the idea is that of coordinated consenting follows from the Griggs report, which one of the things that identified was that it can take a long time to get an application through because a developer might apply to the planning authority first, then SEPA subsequently, and then Fish Health Inspectorate subsequently. And one of the thinking is that we create a process where pre-application process and the application process start at the same time, are coordinated, so there's less duplication and much more cooperation and between the public bodies and their advisors. And in terms of where we are at the moment, we've had pilots. We've got 11 pilots underway, as I said before, and 4 completed the pre-application stage. One of the companies, Scottish Sea Farms, told us the other day that they thought that shaved about a year off the timescale for getting an application through. But one of the real things we want to do at the early stage is identify right at the front, when the developer's just starting to think about a proposal, where there's any showstoppers. It avoids wasting their time. If the development is not going to be suitable in that location, it avoids wasting the public sector's time, and it allows sustainable projects to move more swiftly through the process later on. So we get everything right. So it's to get the right decision as quickly as possible and avoid work on applications in the wrong location.
Is it aiming to be something similar to the Norwegian model, with sort of a one-stop shop?
What we're trying to do is, for the developer and the public, is to engage with the public sector as if it was one. We all have our different regulatory roles, but we want to work collaboratively so you almost get the combined answer of the public sector.
Thank you.
Alan.
District salmon fishery boards are statutory consultees in the aquaculture planning process, but unfortunately the first 2 pilots that were taken forward were both in areas without district salmon fishery boards. So there was a fundamental issue in terms of the process to be piloting these in an area where you couldn't test the full process.
Oh, but that's the point. So we're expanding in areas where they're not close to wild fisheries. That's why there's no district salmon fisheries. The expansion is away from fisheries.
No, one of them was in Loch Carron. There just doesn't happen to be a district salmon fishery board. It's not that it's not a wild fishery.
The point is that the focus of the sector is to develop in open sea areas away, and it would be nice if you just accepted that.
Okay. Ariane Burgess.
Convener, I've got a couple of questions on this theme 5, which is spatial planning, consenting and community benefit. The first one is that so the committee recommended that an exercise of spatial planning to inform strategic guidance on areas that are suitable or not suitable for salmon farming. So that's what we're getting here. But we've now got a postponement of the National Marine Plan 2 and that's making it harder for us to see how strategic planning will evolve. I'd be interested to get a sense from, and again, I don't know who to start with necessarily, but how should we understand the relationship between the national direction and then we've got the emerging marine plan, regional marine plans such as Shetlands or Orkneys in shaping future farm locations?
Ben? No? Who wants to kick off?
I didn't follow the question. Could you just
Yeah, so
again?
we recommended that there be a national spatial planning exercise. We've got the National Marine Plan 2 that's been delayed, so we're not getting that national view. And in the meantime, we've got these regional plans that are coming in. So how, as a committee, do we determine what's actually really going on? How do we kind of understand the relationship between the national direction, and maybe you don't either, the national direction and the emerging regional plans? So Shetland's got one, I think Orkney's got one, and others have to come forward with them.
Yeah, I think this committee, the Griggs report, has made recommendations that the process should be akin to a one-stop shop, be speeded up and be away from sensitive locations, whether that's wild fisheries or other habitats now which are increasingly well mapped. So the industry is following the advice of those bodies, including this committee, and the majority of developments are away from that. Alan referenced Loch Carron, but I assume that is not a big expansion, it's a change of equipment or something. So very much the case that expansion is focused on open sea areas, which has been the guidance from regulators, committee, and to speed it up with the Griggs report. So that's happening. If it was captured in an overall document or a GIS, that would be helpful, but I'm not seeing that, and it sounds like you're not seeing it either.
You think that would be something that would be helpful if it showed up in the National Marine Plan too?
Yeah, I think so, but what would be more helpful from that is and I hope you can see that the advice from the committee and the advice from regulators is bearing fruit in the sense that the expansion, if any, because don't forget this industry has been the same size for a long time now. It's between 150 and 200,000 tonnes. The industry has been the same size for a long time now, so there is no real expansion. But there's a process of trying to make the site mix better and moving them. And if that is being directed by this committee, by regulators, I think that process is happening. If it could be summarised so it's absolutely clear, that would be beneficial.
Okay. Alan?
Previous role, I worked on the Marine Scotland Bill, and then I worked on National Marine Plan 1, and I'm part of the steering group that's looking at National Marine Plan 2. One of the failings that I see of marine planning in Scotland is that it sets out a series of sector-based policies, but it doesn't really properly think about how those policies interact or properly guide the needs of the various sectors and how they should be managed. And it doesn't articulate really what Scotland's priorities are for the marine environment. So, as I said at the last time I was in front of this committee, we need a more holistic approach, because at the moment it's first come, first served. If you put an offshore wind farm in, or whatever it is you're wanting to put in, you're essentially setting the direction there. So we need a much more holistic approach as to what we're doing. From my perspective, the fact that we have a sectoral marine plan for offshore wind demonstrates the failure of marine planning in Scotland. You shouldn't need to have a sectoral plan if the actual plan is working properly.
Okay, so how do we get to that point of that more holistic approach? What needs to happen?
I suspect you need a proper tiered system. So you mentioned that there's a couple of regional marine plans. The Marine Bill came through in 2010. The expectation at that point was that there would be a series of regional marine plans nested under the National Marine Plan, which is nested under the UK Marine Policy Statement. That system isn't functioning in the way that it was anticipated. There's only, as I say, a couple of regional marine plans. So in areas without regional marine plans, I guess the planners are just looking at the National Marine Plan, which doesn't give the level of resolution that's required to make decisions.
Okay, so just so I understand, so what we need is a marine plan that is kind of broad brush stroke, and then allow nested regional plans that sit within to have that more nuanced local approach of actually what's happening in the waters in that area.
And look for full coverage of regional plans.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Ben, did you want to come in?
No, I think this is all helpful, but, you know, you can write as many documents as you like and you can write as many plans as you like, but I think more needs to be done on actual conservation and coal-face projects on the rivers.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've got this system with national marine plans and all those things that happened before I got into this role. But can I ask, I've got a question around community benefit. We had a recommendation on that. So the committee recommended clearer good practice principles for community benefit rooted in local priorities. And I'd be interested to get a sense from members of the panel. I think maybe if I can go to Ben and also Dr. Alan Wells and anyone else who would like to come in. I'd be interested to understand, what does meaningful community benefit look like in practice, and how should it be weighed against economic production and consideration?
Yeah, I think for me, you know, meaningful community benefits is high quality, long careers, well paid, providing jobs and an economy. That's the basic that you would expect. I think then that salmon farming companies are embedded within the infrastructure of communities, supporting schools, supporting low-cost housing. I think there's over 65 examples of those things in infrastructure. And I think ultimately the test is that communities invite you in and have a fairly business-like discussion with you about supporting aquaculture. And trust me, when that happens, and it happens to a majority of the companies, it's quite refreshing where they say, okay, we're open to the idea of a salmon farm in this location. What are you going to bring to our community? And that's a very fair question. So I think from a tax perspective, it ticks the box because it pays additional to the Crown Estate. And I think the discussion with communities about what you can bring in terms of community benefit is very clear now. And I'm pleased to play a part in it.
Okay, but there are, I mean, I think on our trip to Oban, we met with community members who had salmon farms in their area, but didn't want them. So I'm hearing the bit about where there is a place where the salmon farms are accepted in and being embedded in the community, but what about the situation where communities
the majority of people on the west coast and the highlands and islands want salmon farming for all the benefits economically that it brings. It's an intrinsic part of the community. Again, respectfully, I think that you spend more time with people that don't want salmon farms, but they are in the minority. They are very organised, they are well funded, and they are very vocal. I do not diminish the concerns. I spend quite a lot of time engaging with them and answering with them. But the majority of people are absolutely clear that salmon farming is an economic powerhouse in remote rural areas. It's a sustainable operation. It's a highly desirable Scottish provenance product. And they want to invite it in, but they also want to ask the fair question, what's in it for our community? And I'm no different to any of the other MDs or leaders. I actually enjoy answering that question. What's in it for the community? I think it's a fair question. It should be answered early on, and we try and do as much as we possibly can whilst making our business more profitable.
Okay, thanks for that.
I'm now going to move to a question from Edward Mountain.
Thank you very much, Convener. It's always rather frustrating, Convener, when you come in at the end and you've listened to all the evidence sessions and you know you're going to go back to questions that have already been asked. But I feel I must just make a comment at the start, or two comments, if I may, Convener. One is the issue of Loch Carron, which was mentioned. It's a very small river with 3 proprietors, doesn't need a fishery board, and they are heavily stocking. The other issue that I find really difficult as a farmer, and I support farming and aquaculture, Ben, you may be surprised to know, that where there's farming, there's dying. There's always an element of dying. But it's not fair to say that salmon die in greater numbers or anywhere else. In the wild, there are wild problems like predation, flooding, drought, water temperatures, to mention but a few, which is why there are huge numbers of death. But in hatcheries and fish farms, all of those are controlled. And therefore, there shouldn't be the level of death. And to compare the two, I think, is slightly disingenuous. Ben, I want to take you back, if I may, to the 2nd of May 2018. No doubt you reread your evidence to the committee in those days. I love looking back. And just take you to the figures when we were talking in that stage about numbers and reporting. And you said, I work globally with marine harvest, where a 7% mortality rate in the seawater phase would be top of the pile. 7% is what we were saying. Could you just give me the figures for mortality in 23, 24 and 25 for Maui in the seawater?
I have re-looked at it and I have scrutinised it, and I think that you quoted out of context there. I told you at the time that the mortality in the best year ever that I'd experienced in Marine Harvest Scotland, as it was at the time, was 5.2%. That was biomass. The actual mortality in individuals in numbers terms was around 12. And I also referenced that best in class at that point of time was the Faroes, which was around 7%. Now, the Faroes has gone up slightly because they also have experienced environmental challenges like AGD, but the Faroes is still best in class at around 11%. So I don't think there's anything wrong with what I've said, and I don't know why you're raising it as such a, and I just don't want it as such an issue.
Well, Ben, with respect,
with
respect, I asked you a direct question. I gave you a direct quote, and I gave you the quote. I'll read it to you again. I was about to clarify the figure. I work globally for marine harvest, where a 7% mortality rate in the seawater phase would be of 7% per se mortality in the seawater phase would be top of the pile. That's a direct quote. That's what you said to the committee. I'm not asking you to qualify it. I'm asking you to give me the figures for Maui in 23, 24 and 25. I'm entitled to do that, and I expect an answer.
Okay, and I'm coming to that, but you interrupted me, so I'm coming to that now. So, as I've said, at that time, best in class was the Faroes, and it was 7% on an annual basis. So that's not a cycle basis. That's 7% of the fish held in that business unit at the time succumbed to mortality. That's now moved to about 11%. I've given you the figures already today, if you listen to them. The Faroes is 11%, Maui was 14.7%. In Scotland, last year, Maui was 21% in numbers and 17% in biomass. It was a major improvement on previous years, but I'm not happy with it. I still think it's too high. And we're doing
24 and 23 figures, please.
For Maui?
Yes, please.
I can give you them from the industry because I'm representing the industry today, and I've actually jotted
Well,
them all
I can't
down.
believe, as the senior representative, you don't know those figures off the top of your head, if you say that mortality is the most important thing.
Just for time scale, I can write and clarify that within a few hours, or I could get my laptop and look at it now. But the level has come down. 2022 and 23 were difficult. The level was high, above 25%, and now it's around 20 on numbers.
Okay, so I actually have to say that I've read very carefully the official records. It was never mentioned, FARE's never mentioned in any of your quotes. But I want to turn to the second one, which was having worked in the industry on a scientific and farming capacity for 18 years, my observation that is if you farm in seawater stage that lasts from 18 to 20 months and you have a below 5% mortality, you can account yourself about best in class. That's exactly what you said. You didn't quantify where it was in the world. So we're talking about figures about 5 or 7%. And we're now talking about, I think, the industry, we're talking about 25% roughly, and somewhere between 25 and 21% in 24. We're talking about figures that have risen between 5 and 7% to figures almost 4 times what they were.
Kavina, at some point I have to protest with this. What you're doing there is taking my honest delivery of fact to you, which is the best in class that I've ever seen, and then applying it to the average of a sector, and then you're about to suggest that somehow what I'm saying is wrong or this sector is out of control. It's not balanced, it's not fair, and it's certainly not accurate.
Well,
I'm happy to meet with you and go through it. I'm happy to write to you and clarify it, but the way you're putting it across is not balanced in my view.
Well, in fairness, Mr Hatfield, the figures I'm giving you, the figures you gave the REC committee on the 2nd of May 2018, which was an inquiry into aquaculture in Scotland, not the Faroese or anywhere else. But turning to the second point, the last point, which you were talking about, spatial separation, the committee's report in 2018, if you look at recommendations 45 to 49, talked about moving fish farming away from areas where they would conflict with wild salmon. Can I ask how many farms have been moved away from areas where there's a conflict since 2018? I can think of one, if it helps you, but I can't think of any more. Could you
please proceed?
Well, Poole-U, I think was one example. I can't see any more.
There was Loch Eel. Then there was a look at whether we should move Loch Duick. But then the sea lice control at Loch Duick improved so much that we deemed that wasn't necessary and the mortality fell.
Yeah, but this was spatial planning to do with wild salmon, and Poole-U's the only one.
No, I just said to you, so there was Poole-U, there was, from Maui, there was Loch Eel, then we looked at Loch Duick.
Did you move Loch Eel?
Yes.
And did you move Loch Duick?
No, the sea lice control improved to a level where it was absolutely minimal and we're satisfied with that.
So, as an industry, which you're representing to now, how many have moved?
The first iteration of the sea lice risk framework came out with only 19 sites out of over 250 that had a theoretical risk to wild salmon when the model predicted to by a factor of over 4 to 5. So if you take that there's only 19 sites which have a theoretical risk, that's actually quite a good thing, and you should be able to manage them. But you line of questioning, Maui has been proactive in moving sites and working with wild fish, and we continue to be so. Any expansion that we have is in areas of open water where there's reduced conflict, and I think that's good, and there's examples of it throughout the sector, but I'll just yield for time, if that's okay.
Do you have further questions?
If I may, just so I understand it, given the problems that have been at Kishorn A, B and C with disease and deaths and mortality, they continue to operate, and in the report it says that areas where there were high mortality rates, then resiting or removal should be the chosen option. Could you just, you've given me Loch Duick was an example where you thought about it, but have got it on top of it. How many have closed down because they constantly have mortality, high mortality across the industry?
Is this Loch Kishorn where the rod catch on that river has increased dramatically? The
No,
wild rod catch.
That's not what I asked. The question is,
I'm just clarifying with you. It's the same location.
Yes, but I'm asking how many have closed down in the industry since 2018 where there has been high mortality or high sea lice?
Well, less than half of the available consent is currently farmed. The industry hasn't expanded. It's somewhere between 150 and 200,000 tonnes. So there isn't the expansion that you like to portray. And then the farms are looking to constantly try and get the best locations. So Kishon A and B have had some high mortality. I'm absolutely confident that the managers and every employee in that company is doing its best to minimise it. And possibly they are looking at a relocation. And if the regulatory policy would support that and speed it up, I think that would be a good thing. But you're talking about an area where, because of the conservation work that's been done on the river, those problems exist. They're being managed by the farmers. But the rod catch on the River Carron has gone to its highest level in recent years. Well, and that goes back to my point about it's all great to talk and write reports, but actually fish need coal-face conservation.
Okay, so I haven't got an example of a fish farm that's moved or closed down because of high mortality. That was the question. Convener, I would happily meet with Ben any time he wants to come in my office, and I'm very happy to say on the record that I've invited him, so he doesn't need to make a declaration on the lobbying register because I've invited him in. So happy to meet with him, happy to discuss those issues, because it doesn't appear that I'm getting the answer.
And give you a list of farms that have been relocated.
And relocated because of wild salmon and relocated because of disease across the whole industry. I think it would be better to go to the committee rather than me as I'm sitting on the committee. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you. Happy to do that. From rough memory, over the course of the last decade or so, there's more than a dozen. I just can't think of them under the pressure. So I'll write and clarify that.
Okay, thank you. Rhoda Grant.
And just a wee point to put on the record. Edward Mountain seemed to dismiss the work that was going on the River Carron. And I'm thinking if we're leaving a legacy report, we should actually be telling the next committee to look at what is happening on the River Carron, because they've got award-winning work going on there that is actually conserving wild salmon. And I wouldn't dismiss it. And I don't think Edward meant to, but it was the way you phrased it.
Put on record, I absolutely am not dismissing the work that goes on Loch Carron. Huge amount of work. I know all the people involved, and if they thought I was dismissing it, I'd probably be strung up from a lamppost in Loch Carron. There's a huge amount goes on, but the issue is they weren't discussed what happened with the fish farm on Loch Carron, and the only way out of the River Carron is past the fish farm.
I also don't want to dismiss the works going on, but just from a point of fact here, from memory, and it is from memory, the rod catch on the River Carron last year in the official statistics was 1 grilse and 13 salmon. So it's nothing approaching the maximum levels that they've been at.
I actually, again, that's 1 year, absolutely selective, and I hope that's not deliberate. But if you go and look at the catch statistics on the River Carron, the work that Bob Kyness have done with hands-on coal-face conservation, I actually admire him. I think he's done a fantastic job, and it's very disappointing that you don't accept that that's the way forward.
Okay, I think I've got an appropriate question to draw this session to a close. So the idea of today was to take evidence on the progress being made in implementing the recommendations from a report back in 2025. And that report concluded that although the status quo had changed to some extent since 2018, the slow rate of progress improving the regulation and enforcement of the industry needed to be addressed as a matter of urgency to future-proof the industry and to enable it to grow sustainably. So my question is, 12 months on, do the witnesses or stakeholders or regulators that are on the panel today accept that the rate of progress is acceptable? And we have seen progress. Well, I think we have seen progress, but whether that rate of improvement will future-proof the industry and enable it to grow sustainably. And I'm just going to pick from my right to left. Cathy.
Thanks. It's a challenging question to ask. I think from a welfare perspective, and that is my sort of jurisdiction, if you like, there are significant welfare concerns with the industry, and that is taking welfare as what the fish experience. That is our definition of welfare. So it's not about how much the industry have worked to deal with that. It's the experience of the fish in those environments. And I think there are still considerable areas of concern. And they are potentially a barrier to, it's hard to say exactly how much of a barrier that is, but I think it is a barrier to sustainability, because welfare always is a barrier to sustainability. When we have high levels of mortality, yes, they're coming down perhaps, but they are still high, and that is a concern from a welfare point of view. So I would say we are not, from a welfare perspective, I would say there are still very significant concerns.
But is the rate of progress acceptable? Is there, from your view, whilst we accept some will believe that there's different levels of impact on fish welfare, is the rate of progress acceptable?
I find that a very hard question to answer, I'm afraid, because I think that on the one hand, we have the industry, and I accept the industry works hard but there's some of the challenges the industry face are not things perhaps that are easy fixes, and so therefore it's going to take a long time, and perhaps there are issues around where some of these, where the farms are sited that are contributing to welfare problems that perhaps we need to see faster progress in maybe recognising that there are places where fish cannot be farmed in good welfare.
Yeah, I suppose I'm going back to this whole meeting is about progress and ultimately the rate of progress. So again, given everything you've said and the challenges, is that rate of progress? Because ultimately that's what we're reporting on today. Because we wanted to come back after 12 months and decide whether the rate of progress was acceptable or not. Given everything you know about the challenges industry has that rate of progress, is it acceptable, or does it need to speed up, and is the industry able to do that? And that goes for everybody, so just make the question clearer.
Sure. I think from a welfare perspective, I would like to see the rate of progress be faster.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think we take that on board. I think the rate of progress, from my perspective, has been acceptable. I think we can do more. I think we respect the right of this committee to demand more, and that's fair. So we'll look at that. But I think the social licence that we have, when communities invite you in to talk about the benefit of having a salmon farm in their area, that happens often. I think it's very healthy. We're incredibly humble to have that level of social licence, but we're cognizant of the increased activity and scrutiny, particularly from animal welfare, vegan, vegetarian charities. I have no problem with that, other than it doesn't represent what the majority of UK or Scottish residents want to have. They want to have locally produced proteins to the highest standards, and that's what we do in Scotland. So we have the highest standards. You've frequently asked us to go further and faster. We respect that and we take that on board. I think government needs to speed up on its recommendations, and we're there to help with that. And we're there to help work with all the stakeholders to try and get it moving to a better place even quicker.
Thank you. Amy.
So I start... It is on, is it? I can't see. The angle is funny. So I started working for APHA in February 2023. In that time, we've had the publication of the welfare time of killing for fish. We have recently agreed with Scottish Government a programme for routine inspections of harvesting sites, for routine inspections of fish farm facilities, which we didn't have in place when I started. We're now supported to train more of our vets to have specific skills in fish health and welfare. So I don't know if it could go faster, but from my point of view, we have made progress since I joined APHA, not because of me, but because this is what I've been able to observe since I've started there.
Yeah, thank you. Peter.
SEPA is very ambitious in how we want to improve our services, regulatory service, how we want to protect and improve the environment. And I think when you're ambitious, it's never quick enough. You can never move fast enough. But I believe that we are absolutely committed and working hard to improve every aspect, how we work, not just how we regulate, but how we work with other regulators and advisors as well, and the public. There are always headwinds. Some of them are matters of legal proceedings at the moment, but we are very ambitious and we will keep moving fast.
Thank you. Neil.
Yeah, speaking from a fish health inspector perspective and just jumping on the back of some of Amy's comments, on the welfare aspect, we've certainly improved our communications with AFA, and we're looking to do that further forward in a more structured manner too. But in terms of the recommendations, certainly the ones that FHI have been in, I think we have made significant progress on those. I think I've referred already to the persistent elevated mortality recommendation. That has taken a large chunk of our resource to deliver on that, and I'm hope that committee will see when they receive the report that we know we've taken that really seriously from that perspective. But we have delivered on other things as well, including the no count issue that was a recommendation. We've not touched on that today. And improving the text on our website in relation to that. It's not yet been published, but that will be published soon. And whilst Cabinet Secretary didn't agree to take forward a recommendation about having more mortality data or more information, what we have done is improve the narrative around the existing data sets. And I think committee have been provided with a draft of that, or will be provided with a draft of that soon. So that helps really to explain what information is out there, its significance, how it can be used and applied, and what the limitations are with it.
Thank you. Alan.
In the specific areas within our locus, I think, no, things haven't moved fast enough. But if you were to ask me the same question in relation to a whole series of other pressures that wild salmon face, you would probably get the same answer. So we have a species in crisis. We need to see concerted action across the board, including on sea lice and escapes.
That concludes our evidence taken this morning. I really appreciate that we've run nearly an hour over time, but it's been hugely helpful in updating us on the progress that the authorities as well as the industry has made over the last 12 months. I very much appreciate that. And I suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. So our next item on the agenda is consideration of the draft Marine Licensing Exempted Activities Scottish Inshore Region Amendment Order 2026. And I welcome to the meeting Mary Goujon, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, and our officials. We have Jill Barber, who's the Head of Aquaculture Development, and Joseph Trescott, who is the Aquaculture Policy Manager. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement.
Thanks very much, Convener. So essentially the SSI that's in front of the committee today amends existing exemptions to marine licence requirements for the purpose of reducing duplication in the aquaculture consenting framework, providing clarity and transparency, but also ensuring that robust environmental protection. And the SSI is introduced alongside the Environmental Authorisation Scotland Amendment Regulations 2026, and these identify SEPA as the regulator for fish farm environmental discharges between 3 to 12 nautical miles. Now, the Scottish Government is committed to clarifying the consenting process for aquaculture between 3 to 12 nautical miles to ensure that there's an effective approach to regulation and consenting of aquaculture development and activity across Scotland's inshore region. Now, this latest package of SSIs seeks to transfer the regulatory responsibility for fish farm environmental discharges between 3 and 12 nautical miles from Scottish Government's Marine Licensing Operations Team to SEPA, making SEPA the lead regulator for this activity across the Scottish inshore region. And it also introduces amendments to existing marine licence exemptions by extending the exemption on deposit of farm substances from 3 nautical miles out to 12 nautical miles, and it clarifies the scope of the exemption on deposit of fish farm equipment and strengthens the prerequisites for its use. Now, we have carefully considered which regulator is best placed to manage environmental discharges from fish farms between 3 and 12 nautical miles, and identifying SEPA as the lead regulator for fish farm discharges builds on the previous work that we've undertaken to consolidate SEPA as the independent environmental regulator of fish farms. Now, the Environmental Authorisations SSI identifies SEPA as the lead regulator, and the provisions of the Marine Licensing SSI under consideration today mean that a licence from the Scottish Government's Marine Licensing Operations Team will not be required for the same activity, which mirrors the existing requirements between the 0 to 3 nautical mile. Now, changes will ensure that we have the robust environmental protection. We've identified a consistent lead regulator in Scotland's inshore zone, while also avoiding what would be a duplication of resource between Marine Directorate Lot and SEPA. And it will also ensure developers are not required to seek separate consents for the same activity, which then reduces that regulatory burden and cost to business. Amendments to an existing exemption on the deposit of fish and shellfish farm equipment are also being introduced to clarify that the exemption applies to all equipment used directly in the course of fish and shellfish farming, where the relevant conditions and requirements of the exemption are met. A new requirement on the use of the exemption is included to ensure that any equipment to which an exemption is to be applied must have planning permission in place before use of the exemption is considered. And these amendments will result in a fully consistent approach to fish and shellfish farm consenting within Scotland's inshore waters, with a single regulator responsible for each of the consents required to develop and operate a farm within that region. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Any questions? Ariane Burgess.
Yeah, thanks for that opening statement, Cabinet Secretary. We've just had an extensive session on salmon farming, and I think one of the concerns I have with this SSI is it's potentially a bit premature. So we're aware of an appeals process that's happening with SEPA involved, and here we are expanding their workload, and I'm just concerned about the resources that SEPA would have to implement this. And I'm looking at all the responses to the consultation, even though there's some where they say they agree. If you dig into the consultation and the responses, the kind of key concern is, does SEPA have the capability and capacity at the moment to actually do this? So I just wonder if we're just a bit, and given this appeals process is tying them up, just wondering if we're doing this a bit too soon.
I don't believe that we are taking that this is happening too soon, because ultimately we need to provide the clarification as to how this is regulated in the 3 to 12 nautical mile zone, which is why we're bringing this package of SSIs forward for the committee's consideration. I think in terms of the the question you raise about SEPA and the resourcing of that, and I understand there were concerns raised in the consultation. However, we've discussed that with SEPA themselves. They don't have that concern. I think in terms of even just the number of applications that you would expect to see, I don't think that would be expecting to see huge numbers. And also the fact that this is work that SEPA are already doing within the 0 to 3 region, or within the inshore region at the moment. And if anything, it actually works out better, because I think if the SSI wasn't supported today, and say the negative SSI passed, which the committee would be considering after, what it would mean is that the Marine Directorate would have to licence that, but they would still have to look to SEPA to consult with to provide that same evidence and information. And that would actually be a heavier resource burden on SEPA, because they wouldn't then be able to then claim the cost back for the charges in the way that they would if they were the regulator, and because they can implement cost recovery on any applications for that. So it would actually, I think, more negatively impact SEPA. It would also duplicate the regulatory requirements, which is why we're trying to streamline that today.
Beatrice Wishart.
Cabinet Secretary, do you have any sense of just how many applications there might be going further out to sea?
That's the thing. I mean, we know from some of the operators that some aren't potentially looking at that space. But again, within the vision for sustainable aquaculture that we set out, we know that there are other that is an area of interest for other operators. So again, it's important that we have the regulatory framework in place to deal with any potential applications that come forward, again, which is why we're introducing this today.
Yeah.
Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Just to clarify again that SEPA's already doing this out to 3 miles. So this is about extending it to 12 nautical miles, but it's about simplification and non-duplication of legislation so that we have a framework that is more manageable and easier for people to then follow.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And all we are looking to do today is essentially mirror what's happening in the 0 to 3 nautical mile range and extend that out to 12 nautical miles.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you. And we now move on to our next agenda item, which is formal consideration of the motion to approve the instrument, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move motion S6M 20638.
I have no further comments to add, Convener, so I'm happy to formally move.
Thank you. Any members wish to debate? Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Looking at the evidence in the consultation, I do want to raise concerns. So the Scottish Fishermen's Federation say their position remains that they don't support the extension of aquaculture from 3 nautical miles to 12. They do recognise the benefits of making the process more consistent across the entire 0 to 12 nautical miles, but are uncertain whether SEPA has sufficient resources or the expertise to cope with the additional region. And they've got the same concerns for the Marine Directorate licensing, can't remember what that stands for, but the licensing team. Remaining as the regulatory body. So while the proposal in this consultation may appear administratively coherent, on paper I am concerned that they are premature in practical terms. The central issue remains the well-evidenced failure of the current regulatory system to enforce environmental standards effectively, despite already having the legal powers to do so. Simply consolidating responsibilities under SEPA without first addressing the underlying enforcement gap risks creating a more streamlined system that still fails to prevent environmental harm. And in fact, it could make harmful activity easier to progress rather than strengthen oversight. I'm concerned that expanding the scope of regulation without a corresponding increase in resources, capacity, and where necessary powers is unlikely to achieve the stated objectives. Without tackling enforcement and funding head-on, structural reorganisation alone will not deliver the meaningful improvements we desperately need. And we heard this morning from Dr. Alan Wells that we're facing the situation where wild salmon are a species on the edge, a species in crisis, and that not enough is being done. So I have great concerns about expanding SEPA's remit. And as I said earlier, I think, yes, at some point, but once they have the regulation of the 0 to 3 nautical miles in much better shape.
No other members. Cabinet Secretary.
I think I just want to be clear, because I think there are obviously a number of issues that were raised in the previous session, and I wouldn't want us to conflate any issues with what we're actually looking at and discussing today. And I think I would just want to also emphasise the point that not agreeing to the SSI today would actually have more resource implications and capacity implications on the Marine Directorate because of the duplication, as well as for SEPA, who would still be a consultee to any applications through this process, where they then wouldn't be able to recover the costs for that compared to if they were the lead regulator. So I think I have more concern about the resources and capacity issue should the SSI not be agreed than if it is agreed going forward. And again, we've engaged in these discussions with SEPA, who are comfortable with the proposals.
Thank you. Is the committee content to recommend approval of the instrument?
Yes. No.
We are not. We'll go to a vote. Those who are content, please raise your hand now. Those who are not content? Those wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 5 for, beg your pardon, 7 in favour, none against, 1 abstention. The motion is therefore agreed. Finally, is the committee content to delegate authority to me to sign off on our report on the instrument? Thank you. That completes consideration of the instrument. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary and your officials, for attending. I'm going to ask you to remain at the table. Don't panic. On the basis that we expect the next agenda item not to take very long. Our next item of business today is consideration of a negative instrument, the Environmental Authorisation Scotland Amendment Regulations 2026. Do members wish to make any comment on the instrument? No. That concludes our business in public, and we'll now move into private session and suspend the meeting.